The valet's hand hit Nyla's shoulder hard enough to send her stumbling off the curb. 9 years old, 70 pounds soaking wet. And she went down on one knee in the gutter while rain hammered the back of her neck. The envelope, her mother's last chance at keeping a roof over their heads, slipped from her fingers and landed in a puddle, ink bleeding through the soggy paper like a wound opening up. Inside the idling Mercedes, billionaire CEO Grant Calder didn't even glance up from his phone. He had a gala to attend, a speech to give, a reputation to maintain. But when Nyla pressed her small palm against the bulletproof glass and mouthed one word through the rain-streaked window, "Help," something in her desperate eyes made him do the one thing he never did. He cracked the window and listened. If you want to see how one word changed everything, stay with me until the end. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Nyla's story travels. The rain came down in sheets that Thursday evening, the kind of October downpour that turned Seattle's streets into rivers and sent everyone with sense running for cover. Everyone except Nyla Brooks, who stood shivering on the corner of 5th and Pine, clutching a manila envelope against her chest, like it contained the deed to a kingdom instead of a crumpled rejection letter and her mother's handwritten appeal. She was 9 years old, small for her age, the kind of kid who disappeared in a classroom photo, always stuck in the back row, always slightly out of focus. Her sneakers, 2 sizes too big, bought from the Goodwill on Aurora, were completely soaked through, and her jacket, a thin windbreaker that had seen better days 3 owners ago, did absolutely nothing against the cold. But Nyla wasn't thinking about being wet or cold. She was thinking about the number circled at the bottom of the letter in her mother's shaky handwriting. $847.23. That was how much they were short. That was the difference between keeping their apartment and sleeping in the car. That was why she was standing in the rain outside the Fairmont Olympic Hotel, waiting for a man she'd only seen in photographs. Grant Calder's face was everywhere in Seattle. Billboards, magazine covers, the side of a metro bus that had rumbled past their apartment complex just last week. He was the founder and CEO of Calder Industries, a tech conglomerate that had made its fortune in cloud infrastructure and then diversified into everything from renewable energy to affordable housing development. Or at least that's what the website said. What Nyla knew was simpler. Grant Calder's company ran something called the Second Start program, and her mother had applied 3 months ago, and they'd been rejected for reasons that made no sense, and now they were out of options. The valet stand was busy. Black cars pulled up in a steady stream, disgorging men in tuxedos and women in gowns that probably cost more than Nyla's mother made in 6 months of working double shifts at the nursing home. The valets moved like dancers, efficient and precise, opening doors and accepting tips and making everything look effortless. Nyla had been watching for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to approach, when she finally saw it, the license plate her mother had made her memorize. CLDR 01. The Mercedes S-Class was black, sleek, and so clean it looked like it had just rolled off a showroom floor. It pulled up to the curb with the quiet confidence of something that cost more than most people's houses. And Nyla's heart started hammering against her ribs. This was it. This was her chance. She stepped forward, the envelope clutched in both hands now, her voice barely loud enough to carry over the sound of the rain. "Excuse me," she said. "I need to—" The valet, a guy in his 20s with gelled hair and a smile that never reached his eyes, turned on her fast. "Kid, you need to move, now." "But I said move." His hand landed on her shoulder, fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks, and he shoved. Not a gentle redirect, a real shove, the kind meant to send a message. "You don't belong here." Nyla stumbled backward, her arms windmilling, and then her foot caught the edge of the curb and she went down hard. Her knee cracked against the pavement, pain shooting up her leg, and the envelope flew from her hands. It landed in the gutter with a wet slap, and she watched in horror as the rain immediately began to soak through the paper, turning her mother's careful handwriting into an illegible smear of blue ink. "Stay down there," the valet said, already turning back to the car. "And next time, read the room." Inside the Mercedes, Grant Calder was reviewing his speech notes. He had 15 minutes before he was expected at the Children's Healthcare Foundation Gala, where he was scheduled to accept an award for philanthropy and deliver remarks about corporate responsibility and giving back to the community. The irony wasn't lost on him. He knew what people saw when they looked at Grant Calder. A self-made billionaire with a social conscience, a guy who'd pulled himself up from a middle-class childhood in Spokane and built an empire without losing his soul in the process. The reality was more complicated. The reality was that Grant had spent the last decade building systems designed to help people, affordable housing initiatives, job training programs, healthcare subsidies, and watching those systems fail over and over again because good intentions meant nothing without good execution. He was tired. Bone-deep, soul-crushing tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hours he worked and everything to do with the weight of knowing that for every life his programs touched, there were 100 more slipping through the cracks. But he was good at hiding it, good at showing up, shaking hands, giving speeches, cutting checks, good at being the version of Grant Calder that people needed him to be. He glanced up from his phone just as his driver, Marcus, a retired Marine who'd been with him for 6 years and had a sixth sense for trouble, caught his eye in the rearview mirror. "Boss," Marcus said quietly. "You see that?" Grant looked out the window. Through the rain and the tinted glass, he could just make out a small figure crouched in the gutter, soaked to the bone, reaching for something in the water. A kid. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been donated twice over and shoes that were falling apart. And as he watched, she picked up what looked like a sodden envelope, clutching it to her chest like it was the most important thing in the world, and turned toward his car. For a moment, Grant thought she'd walk away. That's what most people did when they realized they were looking at a car that cost more than they'd make in 10 years. They looked away, moved on, accepted the distance between their world and his. But this kid didn't walk away. She walked toward the window, slow and deliberate, and when she was close enough that Grant could see her face clearly, thin, exhausted, with eyes that had seen too much too soon, she did something that stopped his heart. She pressed her palm against the glass, and she mouthed one word. "Help." Grant's hand moved before his brain could catch up, hitting the button that lowered the window. Just an inch. Just enough. "What do you need?" he said. The girl's eyes widened. Up close, she looked even younger than he'd thought, and so tired that Grant wondered when she'd last slept through the night. She held up the envelope, water dripping from the corners, and when she spoke, her voice was small but steady. "My mom applied to your program," she said. "The Second Start thing, for families who need help with housing. They said we didn't qualify, but that's not true. The dates are wrong. Someone changed them." Grant took the envelope through the crack in the window. The paper was falling apart, but he could still make out enough of the letter to see the Second Start logo at the top, his company's logo, and a rejection stamp dated 3 weeks ago. He unfolded the letter carefully, and that's when he saw it. Handwritten notes in the margins, numbers circled, dates underlined, and below that, in a shaky but determined script, "Please, we did everything right. Something is wrong with your system." "What's your name?" Grant asked. "Nyla Brooks." She was shivering now, hard enough that her teeth were chattering. "My mom's name is Tessa Brooks. She works at Sunrise Senior Care, double shifts. She's been there 5 years. We've never been late on rent before, but then she got sick and missed 2 weeks of work. And now we're behind, and the landlord says if we don't pay by Saturday, we're out." Grant read the letter again, more slowly this time. According to the rejection notice, Tessa Brooks had applied on August 15th, 3 days after the application deadline, but the handwritten note in the margin, clearly in Tessa's handwriting, said she'd submitted everything on August 10th, well within the window. And there, at the bottom of the page, was a photocopy of a receipt, a certified mail tracking number dated August 10th, 3:47 p.m. "Someone changed the date," Nyla said again. She was crying now, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "We sent it on time. I was there when Mom went to the post office. I watched her do it. But they're saying we were late, and I don't understand why anyone would lie about that. But we did everything right, and now we're going to lose our home, and I don't know what else to do." Grant looked past Nyla to where the valet was standing, watching the exchange with barely concealed irritation. Then he looked at Marcus, who was still watching him in the rear-view mirror, one eyebrow raised in a silent question. "What are we doing, boss?" What they were supposed to be doing was pulling away from the curb and heading to the gala. Grant was already 10 minutes late, and his assistant had texted twice to remind him that the foundation director was waiting to introduce him. He had a speech to give, a reputation to maintain, a carefully choreographed evening designed to reinforce the narrative that Grant Calder was a good man who used his wealth responsibly. He looked back at Nyla, at this tiny, soaking wet kid who'd gotten shoved into the gutter for daring to ask for help. This kid who'd taken a crumpled, water-damaged letter and turned it into a reason to stand in the rain and wait for a stranger who might not even care. Grant made a decision. "Get in the car," he said. Nyla blinked. "What?" "Get in the car. You're soaked, and we need to get you somewhere dry while I figure this out." He looked at Marcus. "Cancel the gala. Tell them I had an emergency." Marcus didn't ask questions. He just nodded, pulled out his phone, and started typing. Grant pushed the door open, and Nyla climbed into the back seat, dripping water all over the leather upholstery, and looking around with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Where do you live?" Grant asked. "Rainier Valley," Nyla said. "But you don't have to." "Address." She gave it to him, and Marcus pulled away from the curb without another word. The valet was left standing on the sidewalk, staring after them with his mouth hanging open. Grant didn't spare him a second glance. He was already pulling out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he needed. Lila Chen answered on the second ring. "Grant? Aren't you supposed to be at the gala right now?" "Change of plans," Grant said. "I need you to pull every rejection file from the Second Start program for the last 6 months, every single one, and I need them tonight." There was a pause. "Tonight? Grant, that's going to be at least 300 files. I don't care if it's 3,000. Get them." "And Lila?" He looked at Nyla, who was huddled in the corner of the seat, still clutching the ruined envelope. "Find out who's been processing the applications. I want names, and I want them now." He ended the call and turned to Nyla. "Tell me about your mom." So she did. And as the car cut through the rain-slicked streets of Seattle, heading toward a part of the city that Grant rarely saw despite all the work his company supposedly did there, Neela Brooks told him everything. It is. Tessa Brooks was 32 years old, though she looked closer to 40 on her bad days. She'd had Nyla young, 23, unplanned, the father long gone, before Nyla's first birthday, and she'd spent the last 9 years doing everything she could to make sure her daughter never felt the weight of that choice. She worked as a certified nursing assistant at Sunrise Senior Care, a job that paid $19.50 an hour and required her to lift patients who weighed twice as much as she did, clean up messes that would make most people quit on the spot, and absorb the verbal abuse of dementia patients who didn't know her name but knew they were angry. She worked 50-hour weeks when she could get them, picking up extra shifts whenever someone called in sick. She kept a calendar on the fridge where every expense was tracked to the penny. Rent, utilities, groceries, Nyla's school supplies, the copay for Nyla's asthma inhaler. She shopped at the discount grocery store where the produce was always on the edge of going bad, and she'd learned to make a whole chicken last for 5 meals. She was good at stretching $1. She had to be. But in July, Tessa had gotten sick. Not regular sick. The kind of sick where she woke up one morning and couldn't lift her left arm without screaming, where her joints felt like they were full of broken glass, where exhaustion hit her like a truck and didn't let up for weeks. The doctors at the urgent care clinic had run tests and used words like autoimmune disorder and chronic inflammation, and they'd prescribed medications that cost $400 a month, even with insurance. Tessa had missed 2 weeks of work, 2 weeks without a paycheck, and that was all it took to send everything spiraling. The rent was $1,247 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment in Rainier Valley. It wasn't fancy. The heat didn't work half the time. There was mold growing in the bathroom ceiling, and the locks on the front door were so old that Tessa had to jiggle the key for a full minute before it would turn. But it was theirs, and it was close to Nyla's school, and Tessa had kept it for 4 years through sheer force of will. Until she couldn't. August's rent came due, and Tessa was $847.23 short. She called the landlord, explained the situation, begged for an extension. He said no. She asked her supervisor at work about an advance on her paycheck. They said no. She applied for emergency assistance through the county, but the wait list was 6 weeks long. And then, scrolling through Facebook at 2 a.m. while Nyla slept on the pull-out couch, Tessa saw an ad for the Second Start program. Having trouble making ends meet? Calder Industries wants to help. It sounded too good to be true. Programs like that always did. But Tessa was desperate, so she clicked through to the application and she read every word 3 times to make sure she understood the requirements. Household income below $45,000 a year? Check. Proof of employment? Check. Documentation of financial hardship? Check. Application submitted by August 12th? She double-checked the date. It was August 9th. And then she filled out every field, attached every document, and drove to the post office to send it certified mail because the website said physical copies were required. She did everything right. And 3 weeks later, she got a rejection letter saying her application had been submitted late and therefore could not be considered. Chet. Nyla told Grant all of this in a quiet, matter-of-fact voice that made his chest ache. She told him about the morning her mom couldn't get out of bed and how Nyla had called the nursing home to say Tessa was sick and how scared she'd been that her mom might not get better. She told him about learning to cook ramen on the hot plate in their apartment and how she'd figured out which corner store sold day-old bread for half price, and how she always told the school nurse she was fine even when her asthma was acting up because she didn't want anyone calling social services. Mom says if they think she can't take care of me, they'll take me away, Nyla said. So I have to be really careful. I can't be late to school, and I can't get in trouble, and I have to make sure my homework is always done. Because if I mess up, they'll say it's because Mom's not good enough, and that's not true. She's the best mom. She just got sick. Grant didn't trust himself to speak. He stared out the window at the city passing by. His city, the place he'd built his empire, the place where he was supposed to be making a difference, and felt something cold settle in his gut. The car pulled up outside a 4-story apartment building that looked like it had been built in the 70s and hadn't been updated since. The siding was water-stained, the front steps were cracked, and half the windows had bars on them. Marcus put the car in park and looked at Grant in the mirror again. "Want me to wait here?" he asked. "Yeah," Grant said. He turned to Nyla. "Let's go talk to your mom." Tessa Brooks opened the door wearing scrubs that were 2 sizes too big and an expression that went from confusion to alarm to outright panic in the span of about 3 seconds. She looked at Nyla, soaking wet, shivering, standing next to a man in a suit that probably cost more than Tessa's car, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Nyla, what did you do?" "I'm sorry, Mom," Nyla said quickly. "I know you said not to, but I saw his car, and I thought if I could just talk to him." "You went to find him?" Tessa looked at Grant, and he saw the exact moment she recognized him. Her face went white. "Mr. Calder, I'm so sorry. She wasn't supposed to." "It's fine," Grant said, and he was surprised to find that he meant it. "Can we come in?" Tessa stepped aside, still looking like she was waiting for the floor to open up and swallow her whole. The apartment was small, painfully small, and crammed with the kind of secondhand furniture that people bought at estate sales and tried to make work. But it was clean, meticulously clean, the kind of clean that took effort, the kind of clean that said, "I'm trying, I'm doing my best, please don't judge me for what I don't have." Grant sat down on the couch, a floral monstrosity that had probably been ugly in 1987 and hadn't improved with age, and pulled out the soggy envelope. "Nyla said you applied to the Second Start program." Tessa nodded. She was standing in the doorway to the kitchen, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold something in. "I did. On August 10th. I have the receipt." "I saw it," Grant said. "And I saw the rejection letter. Someone changed the date on your application, made it look like you submitted late when you didn't." Tessa's eyes filled with tears. "I knew it. I knew something was wrong. But when I called the office, they said there was nothing they could do, and I didn't know how to... who was I supposed to tell? Who's going to believe me over your company?" Grant felt that cold thing in his gut turn into something sharper. "Someone at my company lied to you, changed your paperwork, made you think you didn't qualify when you did." He looked at Nyla, who was standing next to her mother now, both of them looking at him like he had the power to fix this. And maybe he did. "I'm going to figure out who did this, and I'm going to fix it." "We can't pay you back," Tessa said quickly. If you're talking about a loan or..." "I'm not talking about a loan," Grant said. "The Second Start program is a grant. No repayment required. You qualified. Someone sabotaged your application. That's not on you. That's on me. He stood up, pulled out his phone, and sent a text to his CFO. Transfer $5,000 to Tessa Brooks. Immediate. I'll send account details in 5 minutes. What's your bank information? Tessa stared at him. Your what? Your bank information, routing number, account number, whatever you need to receive a direct deposit. I don't understand, Tessa whispered. You qualified for the program. You're getting the money tonight. He looked at Nyla. And tomorrow, I'm going to find out who's been tampering with applications. Because if they did this to you, they did it to other people. And that ends now. Grant left the apartment 20 minutes later, after Tessa had finally stopped crying long enough to give him her bank details, and after Nyla had hugged him so hard, he thought his ribs might crack. Marcus was waiting by the car, and he didn't say anything as Grant climbed into the back seat, just started driving. Where to, boss? The office, Grant said, and call Lila. Tell her I'm on my way and I want those files ready when I get there. Marcus made the call. Grant stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past, and thought about a 9-year-old kid standing in the rain because she believed that someone in power might actually care enough to listen. He thought about how close he'd come to just rolling up that window and driving away. And he thought about how many other Neelas were out there right now, holding soggy envelopes and waiting for someone to see them. By the time the car pulled up outside Calder Industries' downtown headquarters, a gleaming glass tower that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie, Grant had made a decision. He was going to find out who was sabotaging the Second Start program, and when he did, he was going to burn their world to the ground. Lila was waiting in the lobby, a cardboard box full of file folders balanced on her hip. She looked exhausted, but she managed a wry smile when she saw Grant coming through the doors. 347 rejections, she said. Last 6 months. I pulled everything. Good, Grant said. He took the box from her, surprised by how heavy it was. 347 families. 347 letters saying, sorry, you don't qualify. Who processes these? The applications come through the community outreach department, Lila said. They do the initial review, flag anything that looks questionable, and then send the final approvals up to the executive level. Who's running community outreach? Vivian Kincaid. Grant knew the name. Vivian Kincaid was a vice president, mid-40s, MBA from Stanford, impeccable credentials. She'd been with the company for 8 years, and she ran the community programs with the kind of ruthless efficiency that Grant usually appreciated. But now, standing in the lobby of his own building with a box full of rejected families, he was starting to wonder what else he'd been too busy to notice. Get her on the phone, Grant said, and set up a meeting for first thing tomorrow morning. I want to know how these applications are being processed, and I want to know why so many people are getting rejected. Lila nodded, already pulling out her phone. Anything else? Grant thought about Nyla's face when he'd told her he was going to fix this. About the way her mother had cried like someone had just handed her a lifeline. About how close he'd come to missing all of it because he'd been too focused on a gala speech about corporate responsibility to actually be responsible. Yeah, he said. One more thing. I want you to pull every approval from the last 6 months, too. I want to see who's getting helped and who's getting turned away. I want the full picture. Lila's eyes widened slightly. Grant, that's going to be a lot of data. I don't care. I need to know if this is an isolated incident or if we've got a systemic problem. He shifted the box to his other arm. And Lila, I want this done quietly. No one else hears about this until I know what we're dealing with. Understood? Understood, she said. Grant carried the box to his office on the 42nd floor, set it down on his desk, and started reading. He read through the night, through every rejection letter, every application, every piece of documentation that was supposed to prove why someone didn't qualify for help. And the more he read, the angrier he got. Because Nyla Brooks wasn't an isolated case. There were dozens of them. Families who'd submitted everything on time, who'd met every requirement, who'd done everything right, and still gotten rejected for reasons that made no sense. A single mother whose application was denied because her employer verification was illegible, even though Grant could read it perfectly fine. A veteran whose disability benefits were listed as unverifiable income, despite the official VA documentation attached to his file. A family whose rejection letter cited a missed document that was clearly included in the application, right there in black and white. And all of them, every single suspicious rejection, had one thing in common. They'd all been processed by Vivian Kincaid's department. By the time the sun came up over Elliott Bay, Grant had filled 3 legal pads with notes, and his jaw was so tight it ached. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city waking up below. Somewhere out there, Tessa Brooks was probably checking her bank account, seeing $5,000 that hadn't been there yesterday, and maybe, just maybe, breathing a little easier. Somewhere out there, Nyla was getting ready for school, and for the first time in months, she didn't have to worry about whether they'd have a place to sleep that night. But there were 346 other families who didn't get that call. 346 other families who were still struggling, still falling through cracks that shouldn't exist, still being failed by a system that was supposed to help them. Grant's phone buzzed. A text from Lila. "Vivian's in at 8, conference room C." He checked his watch. 45 minutes. He grabbed his notes, straightened his tie, and headed for the door. Because Vivian Kincaid had some explaining to do. And if Grant didn't like the answers, he was going to tear the whole damn system apart and build it again from scratch. The meeting with Vivian was scheduled for 8. Grant was there at 7:45, sitting at the head of the conference table with 347 rejection files spread out in front of him like evidence at a crime scene. Lila had pulled the approval files too, another 212 folders, and those were stacked on the opposite side of the table. The contrast was stark. The rejections were thin, barely documented, full of vague language and administrative excuses. The approvals were thick, meticulously detailed, every I dotted and every T crossed. Vivian Kincaid walked in at exactly 8 o'clock, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost $3,000 and carrying a tablet instead of files. She had the kind of polished competence that made her easy to trust, the kind of resume that looked perfect on paper. Grant had hired her 8 years ago based on a glowing recommendation from a mutual colleague, and she'd been running community outreach ever since. No complaints, no red flags. Until now. "Grant," she said, smiling that professional smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Lila said you wanted to discuss the Second Start program. Is there a problem?" "Sit down," Grant said. The smile faltered, just a fraction. Vivian sat. Grant slid one of the rejection letters across the table. Tessa Brooks. Applied August 10th. Rejected for late submission. Except she wasn't late. Someone changed the date on her application to make it look like she missed the deadline. Vivian picked up the letter, scanned it quickly, and set it back down. "If there was an administrative error, I'm happy to review." "It wasn't an error," Grant said. "It was deliberate. And she's not the only one." He started pulling files, stacking them in front of Vivian one by one. "Marcus Chen, rejected for illegible employer verification. It's perfectly legible. David Okonkwo, rejected for unverifiable income despite official VA documentation. The Hernandez family. Rejected for a missing document that's right here in the file." He kept going, his voice getting quieter and colder with every name. "Do you want me to keep going?" "Because I can. I've got 347 of these." Vivian's face had gone very still. "Grant, I understand you're upset, but these applications go through multiple levels of review. All in your department," Grant said. "Every single one of these rejections was processed by your team, so either you're incompetent or you're doing this on purpose. Which is it?" The professional mask cracked. Vivian's eyes went hard. "You're accusing me of what exactly? Sabotaging applications? To what end?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Grant said. He leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "Because here's what doesn't make sense. We budgeted $2 million for the Second Start program this year. But according to these files, we've only distributed $800,000. Where's the rest of the money, Vivian?" For just a second, half a second, maybe less, something flickered across Vivian's face. Fear, maybe, or calculation. Then it was gone, replaced by that smooth professional veneer. "The remaining funds are allocated for approved applications that are still in process," she said. "It takes time to verify information, process payments." "Bullshit," Grant said flatly. "Show me the pipeline. Show me the applications that are pending approval." Vivian hesitated. And in that hesitation, Grant knew he was right. "Get out," he said quietly. Grant, get out of my building. You're suspended, effective immediately. And if I find out you've touched a single file or deleted a single email between now and when my lawyers get here, I will personally make sure you never work in this industry again. Vivian stood up slowly. Her hands were shaking, just slightly, but her voice was steady. You're making a mistake. No, Grant said. I made a mistake 8 years ago when I hired you, but I'm fixing it now. Get out. She left. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Grant sat alone in the conference room with 559 files and the sinking realization that this was about to get so much worse before it got better. He called Lila back in. I need a forensic accountant, someone good, someone who can trace every dollar that's gone through the Second Start program for the last 2 years. I'll make some calls, Lila said. She was looking at the files spread across the table with an expression that matched how Grant felt. You really think she's been stealing? I think she's been doing something, Grant said. And I think a 9-year-old kid just blew the whole thing open because she was brave enough to knock on a car window in the rain. Lila shook her head slowly. What do you need from me? Pull her computer, pull her emails, pull everything. And Lila? He looked up at her. I want to know who else knew. Because if this is as big as I think it is, Vivian didn't do it alone. The forensic accountant's name was Dean Porter, and he came highly recommended by Grant's attorney with the caveat that he was expensive, thorough, and occasionally kind of an asshole. Grant didn't care about the first two and figured he could live with the third if it meant getting answers. Dean showed up at Calder Industries that afternoon with a laptop bag and an expression that suggested he'd already decided everyone in the building was probably guilty of something. He was in his 50s, balding, and had the kind of intense focus that made Grant think of bloodhounds on a scent. Show me everything, Dean said without preamble. Grant showed him everything. The rejection files, the approval files, the budget reports, the payment ledgers, every piece of documentation related to the Second Start program for the last 2 years. Dean spread it all out across Grant's conference table, pulled out his laptop, and got to work. 4 hours later, he looked up. You've got a problem, he said. I know that, Grant said. How bad is it? Bad. Dean turned his laptop around so Grant could see the spreadsheet on the screen. Here's what's supposed to happen. Family applies, gets approved, receives a grant payment ranging from $2,000 to $10,000 depending on their needs. The money gets transferred directly to them or to their landlord or utility company, and the transaction gets logged in your system. Simple, right? Right, Grant said, except that's not what's happening. Dean highlighted a column of numbers. Over the last 2 years, your Second Start program has approved 483 grants totaling $3.2 million, but only 212 families actually received money. The rest, 271 families, got rejection letters, and the money that was supposed to go to them? It's gone. Grant's blood went cold. Gone where? That's the interesting part. Dean pulled up another spreadsheet. The money was approved. The paperwork says it was distributed. But if you dig into the actual bank transfers, they're not going to families. They're going to something called Kincaid Consulting Group. Kincaid, Grant repeated, as in Vivian Kincaid's brother Miles Kincaid, Dean said. He incorporated the consulting group 2 years ago, right around the time Vivian took over the Second Start program. And according to the records I pulled, Kincaid Consulting Group has received just over $1.4 million in administrative fees from your program. Fees that, as far as I can tell, you never authorized. Grant sat down. His hands were shaking. She's been stealing from families for 2 years. Looks like it, Dean said. Here's how it works. Family applies, meets all the qualifications. Vivian's team approves them on paper, because they have to, for the audit trail, but then they generate a fake rejection letter with some bullshit excuse. The money gets coded as distributed in the system, but instead of going to the family, it gets routed to her brother's consulting firm as an administrative fee. The family gets screwed, the money disappears, and unless someone actually checks the bank transfers against the rejection letters, no one ever knows. How many families? Grant asked quietly. 271 confirmed, Dean said. Could be more if we go back further, but just in the last 2 years, 271 families who should have gotten help and didn't. And the total theft is about 1.4 million. Grant thought about Nyla Brooks standing in the rain with a soggy envelope, thought about how close she'd come to being just another number on Dean's spreadsheet, another family who got rejected and had nowhere else to turn. Thought about 270 other families who hadn't been lucky enough to have a kid brave enough to track down a billionaire's car. "I want to go to the police," Grant said. "Not yet," Dean said. "If you go to the police now, Vivian and her brother will know you're onto them. They'll destroy evidence, move money, lawyer up. You need to build an airtight case first. Get me another week, and I'll have everything you need to put them both away." Grant wanted to argue. Wanted to say that every day they waited was another day Vivian and Miles Kincaid got to walk around free while the families they'd stolen from struggled to keep the lights on. But Dean was right. If they moved too fast, the Kincaids would slip through the cracks. "1 week," Grant said, "and then I'm burning this whole thing to the ground." Or the week that followed was the longest of Grant's life. He went through the motions, meetings, calls, the endless administrative work that came with running a company. But his mind was always on those files, on Nyla Brooks and Tessa Brooks, and 270 other families whose names he was learning, whose stories he was reading, whose lives had been upended by people who were supposed to help them. Dean worked around the clock, building the case piece by piece. Bank transfers, email threads, approval documents with forged signatures. A paper trail that led directly from Vivian Kincaid's desk to her brother's bank account. By the end of the week, Dean had assembled a file thick enough to bury them both. But when Grant showed up to the office on Monday morning, ready to call the lawyers and the police and anyone else who needed to know, he found Lila waiting outside his office with an expression that made his stomach drop. "We have a problem," she said. "Another one?" "The board called an emergency meeting," Lila said. "They want to talk to you about the Second Start program. Someone told them you're investigating Vivian." Grant's jaw tightened. "Who?" "I don't know. But Grant, they're not on your side. I heard them talking before the meeting. They think you're making this personal. They think you're going after Vivian because she pushed back on one of your pet projects, and now you're using this Brooks family as an excuse to—" "An excuse?" Grant's voice was dangerously quiet. "Lila, she stole 1.4 million from families who needed help. She faked rejection letters. She committed fraud on a massive scale. What part of that sounds like a pet project?" "I know," Lila said, "but they're not looking at the evidence. They're looking at optics. And right now, the optics are that you suspended a well-respected executive without cause, and now you're tearing apart a program that's supposed to be helping people. They're scared you're going to create a PR nightmare." Grant stared at her. "So what are they planning to do?" Lila's face said it all. "They're going to vote you out," Grant said flatly. "I think so," Lila said. "I'm sorry, Grant. I tried to warn them, but—" "It's not your fault," Grant said. He walked past her into his office, grabbed the file Dean had compiled, and headed for the elevator. "Where's the meeting?" "Boardroom, 10th floor." Grant took the elevator down, the file tucked under his arm, and tried to prepare himself for what was coming. He'd built this company from nothing, spent 15 years turning a startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire, hired good people, created jobs, built programs designed to actually make a difference. And now, because he'd had the audacity to hold someone accountable for stealing from the people they were supposed to help, his own board was going to stab him in the back. The boardroom was full when he walked in. 12 directors, all of them looking uncomfortable, all of them avoiding his eyes except for one, Richard Vasquez, the board chair, who met Grant's gaze with something that might have been sympathy or might have been pity. "Grant," Richard said, "thank you for joining us." "I didn't realize I had a choice," Grant said. He set the file down on the table and stayed standing. "What's this about?" "We've received some concerns about your recent actions regarding Vivian Kincaid and the Second Start program," Richard said carefully. "We wanted to give you a chance to explain your perspective before we make any decisions." "My perspective?" Grant opened the file and started pulling out documents, bank statements, email printouts, forged approvals. He spread them across the table like cards in a poker game. "Here's my perspective. Vivian Kincaid and her brother have been running a fraud scheme for 2 years. They've stolen $1. 4 million from families who qualified for help, families who did everything right and got screwed anyway. I have documentation, I have proof, and instead of asking me how we're going to fix this, you're asking me to explain myself. One of the directors, a woman named Patricia Leung, who'd been on the board since the beginning, leaned forward. Grant, we understand you're upset, but this is a serious accusation. You can't just... I have a forensic accountant who spent a week tracing every dollar, Grant said. I have rejection letters that were faked. I have families who got turned away despite qualifying. This isn't an accusation. This is fact. And if you're more worried about optics than about the fact that we've been stealing from people who needed help, then we have a much bigger problem than Vivian Kincaid. It's not that simple, Richard said. Vivian has been with this company for 8 years. She has an impeccable track record. And the timing of this investigation, right after you got personally involved with one family, it raises questions about your judgment. Grant laughed, short and bitter. My judgment? A 9-year-old kid came to me in the rain because someone at my company lied to her mother. She had proof that the system was broken, and instead of ignoring her like I should have according to whatever PR playbook you're all reading from, I listened. And now you're telling me that was a mistake? We're telling you that you're too close to this, Patricia said, that you're not thinking clearly, that maybe you should step back and let someone else handle the investigation. No, Grant said. Grant, no. He looked around the table, meeting each director's eyes in turn. I'm not stepping back. I'm not letting this go. And if you try to force me out because I had the audacity to care about the people this company is supposed to be helping, then you can have my resignation right now. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend that protecting Vivian Kincaid is more important than protecting the families she stole from. There was a long silence. Then Richard cleared his throat. We're going to need to vote, he said. And just like that, Grant knew he'd lost. The vote was 10-2. 10 directors who thought Grant was a liability, who thought he was making this personal, who thought the safest thing to do was remove him before he dragged the company's reputation through the mud. 2 directors, Patricia Leung and an older man named James Okafor, who voted to keep him on, but who were outvoted so decisively it didn't matter. Richard stood up, straightened his tie, and delivered the news like he was reading from a script. Effective immediately, you're removed as CEO of Calder Industries. We'll be appointing an interim replacement while we conduct a search for your successor. You'll retain your shares, of course, but you'll no longer have operational control. Grant didn't say anything. He just gathered up the files, walked out of the boardroom, and took the elevator back up to his office. Lila was waiting, her face pale. They did it, she said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Grant said. They did it. What are you going to do? Grant looked at the file in his hands, at 271 names that deserved better than a company more interested in protecting its reputation than protecting the people it claimed to serve. I'm going to finish what I started, he said. They can take the company, but they can't stop me from making this right. He picked up his phone and started making calls. Because if Calder Industries wouldn't hold Vivian Kincaid accountable, Grant would find someone who would. And this time, he wasn't going to stop until every single family got justice. The law firm of Chen and Associates occupied the 14th floor of a building in Pioneer Square that had seen better days. The carpet was worn, the furniture was mismatched, and the receptionist looked like she was about 19 and working 3 jobs to pay for community college. But when Grant walked through the door at 9:30 that Monday night, still carrying the file that had gotten him fired, the receptionist took one look at his face and didn't ask questions. She just picked up the phone. Javier, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent. Javier Reyes appeared 2 minutes later, wearing jeans and a Sounders t-shirt, his hair still wet like he'd just gotten out of the shower. He was 36, a paralegal who'd spent the last decade working consumer protection cases for people who couldn't afford the fancy downtown firms, and Grant had met him exactly once, at a legal aid fundraiser where Javier had cornered him and spent 20 minutes explaining why Calder Industries' tenant protection clauses were garbage. Grant had listened, made notes, and changed the clauses, and now he was hoping that had bought him enough goodwill to get Javier to take on a case that no sane person would touch. Mr. Calder, Javier said, surprised. What are you doing here? I need help, Grant said, and I'm willing to pay whatever it takes. Javier looked at the file in Grant's hands, then at Grant's face, and something shifted in his expression. "Come on back." They sat in Javier's tiny office, barely big enough for a desk and 2 chairs, and Grant laid out everything. The Second Start program, the fake rejections, Vivian and Miles Kincaid, the $1.4 million in stolen funds, Dean Porter's forensic analysis, and finally, the board meeting that had ended with Grant getting voted out of his own company. Javier listened without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad that was already half full of other people's problems. When Grant finished, Javier sat back and let out a long breath. "So you want to sue your own company?" he said. "No," Grant said. "I want to sue Vivian and Miles Kincaid. I want them prosecuted. I want every family who got screwed to get their money back plus damages. And I want to make sure this never happens again." "That's going to be complicated," Javier said. "The families would have to agree to join the case. Most of them probably don't even know they were defrauded. And the ones who do know are going to be scared of retaliation, scared of legal fees they can't afford, scared of going up against a billionaire's company, even if you're on their side." "Then we make it worth their while," Grant said. "We offer to cover all legal costs. We find every single family, explain what happened, and give them a choice. And if they want to fight, we fight." Javier studied him for a long moment. "You know this is going to destroy your reputation, right? The board's going to spin this as a vendetta. The media is going to have a field day. And even if you win, people are going to remember you as the CEO who got fired for going after his own company." "I don't care," Grant said. And he meant it. "I spent 15 years building Calder Industries because I thought we could actually make a difference. But if the price of making a difference is protecting people who steal from families in crisis, then I don't want any part of it. I'll burn the whole thing down if that's what it takes to make this right." Javier smiled, slow and genuine. "All right then, let's burn it down." They worked through the night, Javier pulling files and case law, while Grant called Dean Porter and arranged for him to hand over everything he'd compiled. By the time the sun came up, they had the skeleton of a plan. Identify every family who'd been rejected under false pretenses, document the fraud, file a class action lawsuit against Vivian and Miles Kincaid, and push for criminal charges. It was ambitious. It was probably crazy. But it was also the right thing to do, and for the first time in a week, Grant felt like he could breathe. At 6 in the morning, Javier's phone rang. He answered, listened for a moment, and his expression went dark. "Turn on the news," he said to Grant. Grant pulled out his phone and opened a news app. The headline hit him like a punch to the gut. Calder Industries CEO removed amid controversy over charity program. The article was brutal. According to unnamed sources, Grant Calder had become obsessed with a single family's complaint and had launched a baseless investigation into a respected executive. The board had voted to remove him for the good of the company and its stakeholders, citing concerns about his judgment and his ability to lead. Vivian Kincaid was quoted extensively, expressing disappointment that Grant had chosen to pursue a personal agenda rather than focusing on the company's mission. There was no mention of the fraud, no mention of the stolen money, no mention of 271 families who'd been lied to. Just a carefully crafted narrative that made Grant look unhinged and Vivian look like the victim. "They're getting ahead of it," Javier said quietly. "Controlling the story before you can tell yours." Grant set the phone down. His hands were steady, but his jaw was so tight it ached. "Then we tell ours louder." "How?" Grant thought about it. About all the times he'd sat for interviews, carefully managing his image, saying exactly what the PR team told him to say. About the years he'd spent being the version of Grant Calder that played well in boardrooms and on magazine covers. About how much good that had done for Nyla Brooks when she was standing in the rain with nowhere else to turn. "We find a reporter who actually gives a damn," Grant said. "Someone who'll investigate instead of just printing whatever the company feeds them. Someone who'll talk to the families." "I might know someone," Javier said. He was already scrolling through his contacts. "Simone Hart. She's with the Seattle Independent. Does investigative work, doesn't pull punches. She's good, and she hates corporate bullshit." "Call her," Grant said. Javier called. Simone Hart answered on the third ring, her voice rough like she'd been up all night or hadn't slept in days. Javier explained the situation in broad strokes, and Grant heard her go very quiet on the other end of the line. I want to see the documents, she said finally. All of them. And I want to talk to the families. If this is real, if you can prove it, I'll run it. But I'm not printing allegations based on a billionaire's hurt feelings. Fair enough, Javier said. He looked at Grant, who nodded. We can meet this afternoon. I'll bring everything. They met at a coffee shop in Fremont, the kind of place where the tables were mismatched and the barista had pink hair and nobody cared if you sat there for 6 hours, nursing a single cup of coffee. Simone Hart was in her early 40s, black, with short natural hair and an intensity that reminded Grant of a particularly determined prosecutor. She showed up with a laptop bag and a voice recorder and got straight to business. Show me what you've got, she said. Grant and Javier showed her everything. Dean Porter's forensic analysis. Whoops. The bank transfers. The fake rejection letters. The internal emails where Vivian discussed processing delays and administrative complications in language that was clearly code for something else. Simone took notes, asked questions, and twice stopped to verify information on her laptop. 2 hours in, she sat back and let out a breath. This is massive, she said. If even half of this holds up, it's fraud on a scale that's going to make national news. But I need more than documents. I need people. I need families who are willing to go on record. We're working on that, Javier said. But most of them don't know they were defrauded. They think they got rejected because they didn't qualify. Then we tell them, Simone said. She looked at Grant. You're going to have to help with that. These families aren't going to trust me just because I show up with a notebook. But they might trust you, especially if you come with money. What do you mean? Grant asked. I mean, you make it right before you ask them to fight, Simone said. You find every family on that list, you cut them a check for what they should have gotten, and you tell them what happened. You give them the choice to join the lawsuit, but you make it clear the money isn't conditional. They get paid either way. That's how you build trust. Grant thought about his bank account, about the personal wealth he'd accumulated over 15 years of building Calder Industries, about how much of it he was willing to spend to fix this. All of it, he realized. Every last dollar if that's what it took. I'll do it, he said. Then I'll write the story, Simone said. But I'm going to need a few days to verify everything. Interview sources, build the narrative. Can you give me until Friday? Friday's fine, Grant said. But after that, this goes public. With or without Calder Industries' blessing. Simone smiled sharp and dangerous. I wouldn't have it any other way. The next 3 days were a blur of activity. Grant and Javier started working through the list of rejected families, cross-referencing addresses and phone numbers, tracking down people who'd moved or changed jobs or given up entirely. Some of the numbers were disconnected. Some of the addresses led to empty apartments or buildings that had been torn down. But slowly, methodically, they started making contact. The first family Grant called was a single father named Marcus Chen, who'd been rejected for illegible employer verification, despite having a letter from his boss on official company letterhead. Marcus answered the phone sounding exhausted, and when Grant explained who he was and why he was calling, there was a long silence. Is this some kind of scam? Marcus asked finally. No, Grant said. It's an apology and an explanation, and if you're willing to meet with me, I'd like to make things right. They met the next morning at a diner in Georgetown. Marcus showed up looking wary, like he was expecting Grant to try to sell him something. But when Grant laid out the evidence, the fake rejection, the money that had been stolen, the fraud that had been going on for 2 years, Marcus's wariness turned to anger. I lost my apartment, Marcus said quietly. I was 2 months behind on rent because my kid needed surgery and insurance didn't cover all of it, and I applied to your program because everyone said it was legit. And then I got that letter saying I didn't qualify. I had to move in with my sister. My son had to change schools. And you're telling me I got rejected because someone was stealing? Yes, Grant said. And I'm sorry. I should have been paying closer attention. I should have caught this years ago. Damn right you should have, Marcus said. But some of the anger had leaked out of his voice, replaced by something that sounded like exhaustion. So what now? You want me to sue? Because I can't afford a lawyer, man. I can barely afford groceries. You don't need to afford anything, Grant said. He slid an envelope across the table. This is a check for $8,000. That's what you should have gotten 2 years ago, plus interest. It's yours whether you join the lawsuit or not. No strings attached. Marcus opened the envelope, stared at the check, and his eyes filled with tears. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Because a 9-year-old kid taught me that being generous isn't the same as being responsible," Grant said, "and I'm trying to learn the difference." Marcus wiped his eyes, folded the check carefully, and put it in his pocket. "What do I have to do to help?" By Wednesday, Grant and Javier had contacted 47 families. 32 of them agreed to meet. 28 of them agreed to join the lawsuit. Each conversation was harder than the last, because each family had a story that made Grant want to tear Vivian Kincaid apart with his bare hands. There was the Hernandez family, who'd been rejected for a missing document that was clearly included in their file, and who'd ended up homeless for 6 weeks because they couldn't make rent. There was David Okonkwo, the veteran whose disability benefits were called unverifiable, despite official VA paperwork, and who'd had to choose between medication and food. There was a woman named Lisa Park who'd been rejected because her job offer letter was undated, and who'd lost custody of her kids because the state decided she didn't have stable housing. Every story was a gut punch. Every story was evidence of a system that had failed people who'd done everything right. And every story made Grant more determined to see this through. On Thursday afternoon, Grant's phone rang. The number was blocked, but he answered anyway. "Grant Calder," he said. "Mr. Calder, this is Vivian Kincaid." Her voice was smooth, controlled, with just a hint of steel underneath. "I think we need to talk." Grant's hand tightened on the phone. "I don't have anything to say to you." "Then just listen," Vivian said. "I know what you're planning. The lawsuit, the investigation, the media blitz, and I'm calling to offer you a way out." "I don't need a way out." "Yes, you do," Vivian said, "because right now you're a billionaire going after a woman who spent 8 years trying to help disadvantaged families. You think the media is going to take your side? You think a jury is going to see you as the good guy? You're delusional." "I have evidence," Grant said. "Bank records, forged documents, 271 families who got screwed because of you." "You have allegations," Vivian corrected. "Allegations made by a disgraced CEO who got voted out of his own company for erratic behavior. Who's going to believe you, Grant? Your own board doesn't believe you." Grant didn't say anything. He was too angry to trust his voice. Vivian continued, her tone softening just slightly. "Here's what I'm offering. You drop this crusade and I'll quietly resign. We'll call it a mutual parting of ways, no hard feelings, and you can go back to whatever you were planning to do with your retirement. The families get their money. I'll personally make sure of it, and everyone moves on. No lawsuits, no scandals, no one's reputation gets destroyed." "You stole $1.4 million from people who needed help," Grant said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You faked rejection letters. You lied to families in crisis. And now you think I'm going to let you walk away because you're offering to clean up your mess quietly?" "I think you're going to let me walk away because the alternative is worse for everyone," Vivian said, "including those families you claim to care about so much. Do you really want to drag them through a lawsuit that could take years? Do you want them to relive their trauma on a witness stand while my lawyers tear them apart? Because that's what's going to happen, Grant. You're not protecting them. You're using them to feel better about yourself." Grant thought about Nyla Brooks, standing in the rain with a soggy envelope. Thought about Marcus Chen, crying over a check that should have been his 2 years ago. Thought about every family who'd trusted a system that had failed them. "No deal," he said. "See you in court." He hung up before Vivian could respond. That night, Javier called with news. "Simone's ready to publish. The article goes live tomorrow morning at 6. "Good," Grant said. He was sitting in his apartment, a penthouse overlooking Elliott Bay that suddenly felt too big and too empty, staring out at the city lights. "Is it going to be enough?" "I think so," Javier said. "She's got the documents, she's got family interviews, she's got quotes from Dean Porter. It's thorough, it's damning, and it's going to explode when it drops." "What about criminal charges?" "I talked to a prosecutor I know in the AG's office," Javier said. "She's interested, but she wants to wait until after the article publishes. See how much evidence shakes loose once it's public. If we're lucky, other victims will come forward, and that'll make the criminal case even stronger. And if we're not lucky? Then we fight harder," Javier said simply. But Grant, I think we're going to win this. I think you did the right thing. Grant wanted to believe that. But sitting alone in his apartment, watching the city he'd tried so hard to help, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd set something in motion that was going to cost him everything. Friday morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that Seattle did better than anywhere else in the world. Grant woke up at 5, made coffee he didn't drink, and waited for 6 o'clock to arrive. At 6:02, his phone started ringing. The first call was from Lila. "Grant, have you seen The Independent?" "Not yet," Grant said. He was pulling up the website on his laptop, hands shaking slightly. The headline was perfect. "Stolen Hope: How a Billionaire's Charity Program Defrauded Hundreds of Families." Below it was Simone Hart's byline, and below that was a photo of Nyla Brooks, taken with Tessa's permission, standing outside their apartment building, looking directly at the camera with those same determined eyes that had made Grant crack his window in the rain. Grant started reading. Simone had done exactly what she'd promised. She'd built an airtight case. The article laid out everything in excruciating detail. The fake rejections, the stolen money, the shell company owned by Miles Kincaid, the 2 years of fraud that had gone undetected because no one at Calder Industries had bothered to check. She'd interviewed 8 families, all of them telling stories that were heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. She'd gotten quotes from Dean Porter explaining how the fraud had worked, and she'd included a statement from Grant that he'd spent 2 hours crafting with Javier's help. "I failed these families," Grant's quote read. "I built a system that was supposed to help people, and I didn't do enough to make sure it was working the way it should. That ends now. Every family who was defrauded will be compensated. Every person responsible will be held accountable. And we're going to rebuild this program from the ground up with real oversight and real consequences for anyone who tries to abuse it." The article ended with a call to action. Any family who believed they'd been wrongly rejected from the Second Start program should contact Chen and Associates, where lawyers were standing by to help. Grant finished reading and sat back, his heart pounding. It was perfect. It was everything they'd needed, and it was about to change everything. His phone rang again, and again and again, reporters wanting comments, former colleagues expressing shock, board members who'd voted him out suddenly claiming they'd had concerns about Vivian all along. Grant ignored most of them, but he answered when he saw Javier's number. "We're getting calls," Javier said. He sounded almost giddy. 20 families in the last hour. People who got rejected and never understood why. People who've been struggling for years because they thought they didn't qualify when they should have. "Grant, this is working." "What do you need from me?" Grant asked. "Get down here," Javier said. "We're going to need more space, more people, more everything. This is bigger than we thought." Grant grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, but before he left, he made one more call. Tessa Brooks answered on the second ring. "Mr. Calder?" "I just wanted to let you know the article's out," Grant said. "Have you seen it?" "I'm reading it now," Tessa said. Her voice was thick with emotion. "You put Nyla's picture in it." "Simone thought it was important to show who this affected," Grant said. "But if you're not comfortable with it, I can ask her to take it down." "No," Tessa said. "No, it's perfect. Nyla's so proud. She keeps showing it to everyone. She says she's famous now." Grant smiled despite everything. "She's brave. You both are." "Mr. Calder, Grant, I don't know how to thank you for this, for believing us, for not giving up." "You don't have to thank me," Grant said. "You and Nyla did the hard part. I'm just trying to finish what you started." He meant it, because standing in his empty apartment, looking out at the city that had just learned what Calder Industries had done to its most vulnerable residents, Grant understood something he should have understood years ago. All the money in the world meant nothing if you weren't willing to actually show up when people needed help. And showing up meant more than writing checks, or giving speeches, or building programs that sounded good on paper. It meant listening when a 9-year-old kid knocked on your window in the rain. It meant believing people when they said the system was broken. It meant being willing to burn everything down if that's what it took to make things right. Grant Calder had spent 15 years being generous. Now he was learning how to be responsible, and he wasn't going to stop until every single family got justice. By noon, Javier's office was overflowing. Families packed the waiting room, spilling out into the hallway, all of them holding rejection letters and applications and stories that needed to be heard. Javier had called in reinforcements, 3 other paralegals from legal aid clinics around the city, 2 law students from the University of Washington, and a retired family court judge who'd volunteered to help coordinate intake. Grant sat in a corner office that Javier had cleared out for him, meeting with families one by one, listening to stories that all sounded heartbreakingly similar. A single mother who'd been rejected for insufficient documentation despite having everything the application required. A disabled veteran who'd been told his income was too variable to verify. A couple who'd lost their home because someone at Calder Industries had decided they weren't worth helping. Each family got a check. Each family got an apology. Each family got a choice. Join the lawsuit or don't. But either way, they were getting what they should have gotten years ago. By the time Grant looked up, it was 7 in the evening and his hand was cramping from signing checks. Javier appeared in the doorway, looking exhausted but satisfied. 63 families today, he said. And we've got appointments booked for the next 2 weeks solid. Grant, I think we're going to hit every single person on that list. Good, Grant said. He stood up, stretched, and felt something in his back pop. What about criminal charges? The AG's office called, Javier said. They're opening a formal investigation. Vivian and Miles Kincaid are both being brought in for questioning next week. Grant felt something loosen in his chest. So we're winning. We're winning, Javier confirmed. But Grant, it's going to get ugly before it gets better. The company's already issuing statements saying you acted without board approval, that you're making unauthorized payments, that this whole thing is a vendetta. They're going to come after you hard. Let them, Grant said. I'm not stopping. Javier grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. Grant left the office just after 8, stepping out into a Seattle night that smelled like rain and possibility. His phone buzzed with another incoming call, another reporter, another board member, another person who wanted a piece of the story, but he ignored it. Instead, he pulled up Simone Hart's article one more time and read through the comments. Hundreds of them, thousands. People sharing their own stories of being failed by systems that were supposed to help. People expressing outrage that something like this could happen. People demanding accountability. And there, near the top, a comment from a user named NylaB2016. This is my story, it read. And Mr. Calder listened when nobody else would. If you're reading this, don't give up. Someone will hear you eventually. Grant closed his eyes and let himself feel it. The weight of what they'd started. The enormity of what was still to come. The knowledge that he'd traded a comfortable life for a righteous fight, and he'd make that trade again in a heartbeat. Somewhere in the city, Vivian Kincaid was probably making phone calls, hiring lawyers, preparing for war. Let her, Grant thought. Because this time, the fight wasn't about protecting a reputation or maintaining an image or keeping a board happy. This time, it was about 271 families who deserved better. And Grant Calder wasn't going anywhere until every single one of them got justice. The backlash hit like a freight train on Monday morning. Grant was in Javier's office reviewing intake forms when his phone lit up with a news alert. Calder Industries had issued a statement, and it was everything Javier had warned him about, and worse. The company claimed Grant had unilaterally diverted company funds without board approval, that he was making unauthorized payments to individuals as part of a personal vendetta, and that his actions raised serious questions about financial impropriety and breach of fiduciary duty. The statement was signed by Richard Vasquez, the board chair, and it ended with a line that made Grant's blood run cold. We are cooperating fully with regulatory authorities to investigate Mr. Calder's recent financial activities. They're trying to flip the narrative, Javier said, reading over Grant's shoulder. Make you look like the criminal instead of Vivian. It's smart, Grant admitted. His jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. They can't defend what Vivian did, so they're changing the subject, making this about me instead of the families. It won't work, Javier said, but he didn't sound as confident as he had 3 days ago. The evidence is too strong. People aren't going to buy it. Grant wanted to believe that. But by noon, 3 major news outlets had picked up Calder Industries' statement and were running stories with headlines like, Former CEO under investigation for unauthorized payments and billionaire's crusade or corporate theft. The articles were careful to mention the original fraud allegations, but they buried them under speculation about Grant's motives and questions about whether he'd broken the law by cutting checks to families without board authorization. His phone started ringing with a different kind of call, financial reporters asking about his personal expenses, business journalists wanting to know if he'd used company funds for the payments. Even a few former colleagues who'd been friendly suddenly sounding concerned about whether Grant had thought through the legal implications of what he was doing. The only person who seemed completely unfazed was Simone Hart, who called at 2 p.m. sounding annoyed. "They're trying to bury the story," she said without preamble. "Every outlet that picked up my article is now running the company's response as if it's equally credible, like there's some actual debate about whether massive fraud happened." "Can you push back?" Grant asked. "I'm writing a follow-up now," Simone said. "But I need something new. Something that proves you're not just some disgruntled ex-CEO with an axe to grind. Can you get me access to more families, more documentation, something that shows this is bigger than the company wants people to think?" Grant thought about the intake forms stacked on Javier's desk. 63 families in one day. Appointments booked for 2 more weeks. Every single one of them with a story that proved the fraud had been systematic, deliberate, and ongoing for years. "How many stories do you need?" Grant asked. "As many as you can give me," Simone said. "I want to run a series, show the scope of this, make it impossible for anyone to dismiss as a personal grudge." "I'll talk to the families," Grant said. "See who's willing to go on record." He spent the rest of the afternoon doing exactly that, calling the families he'd met over the past 3 days and asking if they'd be willing to share their stories publicly. Some said no. They were scared of retaliation, scared of being in the spotlight, scared of what it might mean for their kids. But others said yes without hesitation. Marcus Chen, the single father whose son had needed surgery, agreed immediately. "If my story helps stop this from happening to someone else, I'm in." Lisa Park, the woman who'd lost custody of her kids after being rejected, said yes through tears. "Maybe if people hear what happened, the state will reconsider my case. Maybe they'll see I wasn't the problem." David Okonkwo, the veteran whose disability benefits had been called unverifiable, said yes in a voice that shook with barely controlled rage. "I served my country. I did everything I was supposed to do, and they treated me like I was lying. Yeah, I'll talk. I'll talk to anyone who will listen." By the end of the day, Grant had 15 families willing to be interviewed. He sent their contact information to Simone, who promised to start calling them that evening. And then he went home to his 2 empty apartment and tried not to think about how much this was going to cost him before it was over. The lawsuit started on Wednesday. The first one came from Calder Industries itself, claiming Grant had violated his fiduciary duty by making unauthorized payments and demanding he return every dollar he'd given to families. The second came from a shareholders group alleging that Grant's actions had damaged the company's reputation and stock value. The third came from Vivian Kincaid's lawyers, a defamation suit claiming Grant had maliciously and knowingly made false statements that had destroyed her career. Javier brought Grant copies of all 3 complaints, spreading them across the desk like battle plans. "This is going to be expensive," Javier said bluntly. "They're throwing everything at you. Breach of duty, defamation, shareholder derivative claims. You're going to need a team of lawyers, and they don't come cheap." "How much are we talking?" Grant asked. "Conservative estimate? 2, maybe 3 million just to get through discovery. And that's assuming we don't go to trial on all 3 cases. Grant thought about his bank account, about the personal wealth he'd accumulated over 15 years, about how much he'd already spent on checks to families, and how much more he was planning to spend. "I've got it," he said. "You sure?" Javier asked. "Because this could drag on for years, and if the company manages to freeze your assets, they won't," Grant said. He was more certain of that than he was of anything else. "The money I'm using is mine. Personal funds, not company funds. They can sue all they want, but they can't touch it." Javier nodded slowly. "All right, then we fight. All 3 cases simultaneously. It's going to be hell." "I know," Grant said, and he did. He knew exactly what he was signing up for. The depositions, the legal fees, the endless procedural battles designed to wear him down and drain his resources. He knew that Calder Industries had lawyers who billed $1,000 an hour and would drag this out as long as possible. He knew that Vivian Kincaid's defamation suit was designed to punish him for speaking out, to make him regret ever listening to Nyla Brooks in the first place. But he also knew that somewhere in Rainier Valley, Tessa Brooks was able to pay her rent on time for the first time in months, that Marcus Chen's son was getting the medical care he needed, that families who'd been turned away and told they didn't deserve help were finally getting what they should have gotten years ago. And that was worth every dollar, every lawsuit, every attack on his character. "Let's fight," Grant said. The attacks came from unexpected directions. On Thursday, someone leaked Grant's personal financial records to the press. Not the company records, but his actual bank statements, investment portfolios, tax returns. The leak was illegal, almost certainly orchestrated by someone with access to information they shouldn't have had. But once it was out there, the damage was done. News outlets ran stories about Grant's net worth, $2.8 billion, though most of it was tied up in Calder Industries stock, and about his personal spending habits. They highlighted the penthouse apartment, the investment properties, the charitable donations that suddenly looked suspicious in light of the recent controversy. One particularly vicious editorial suggested that Grant's sudden concern for struggling families was convenient timing, given that he'd spent years living in luxury while people suffered. The hypocrisy of it all made Grant want to put his fist through a wall. The same company that had enabled Vivian Kincaid's fraud for 2 years was now acting like Grant was the problem because he'd tried to fix it. The same board that had voted him out was now claiming he'd been reckless with money that was legally his to spend however he wanted. The same media that had celebrated him as a philanthropist 6 months ago was now questioning whether he'd ever actually cared about anything except his reputation. But the worst part wasn't the attacks on him. The worst part was what they were doing to the families. On Friday morning, Grant got a call from Tessa Brooks. She sounded terrified. "Mr. Calder, someone came to my apartment," she said, her voice shaking. "A man in a suit. He said he was a private investigator, and he wanted to ask me questions about Nyla, about when she went to find you that night, about whether I'd put her up to it." Grant's hand tightened on the phone. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to leave," Tessa said. "I didn't answer any of his questions. But Grant, he scared me. He was asking about my job, about Nyla's school, about whether we'd ever had any involvement with Child Protective Services. It felt like he was trying to find something to use against us." "He probably was," Grant said, his voice hard. "The company's trying to discredit the families who are speaking out, make you look like you're lying or taking advantage or, I don't know, something that lets them avoid talking about the actual fraud." "What do I do?" Tessa asked. "I can't afford to lose my job. I can't have CPS showing up because some investigator convinced them I'm an unfit mother. Nyla's finally doing better. She's sleeping through the night again. She's not worried about where we're going to live, and now this?" "You don't have to do anything," Grant said. "You don't have to talk to investigators. You don't have to answer questions. You don't have to engage with any of this. If anyone shows up again, you call Javier immediately. He'll handle it." "But what if they won't," Grant said more firmly than he felt. "I won't let them. You and Nyla are off limits. If the company wants to come after someone, they can come after me. But they don't get to harass the people they already hurt." Tessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said very softly, "Thank you for protecting us, for not walking away when this got hard." Grant thought about how close he'd come to doing exactly that. To rolling up his window and driving to the gala, to ignoring Nyla's plea for help, to staying comfortable and uninvolved while people suffered. He thought about the man he'd been a month ago, the man who genuinely believed that writing checks and funding programs was enough. "You and Nyla protected yourselves," Grant said. "I'm just trying to catch up." But protecting the families was getting harder by the day. By the following week, 3 more families reported being approached by private investigators. One was asked about a misdemeanor conviction from 15 years ago. Another was questioned about gaps in their employment history. A third was asked why they'd applied to multiple assistance programs over the past year, as if needing help from more than one source somehow proved they were scamming the system. Javier filed for restraining orders against the investigation firm, arguing that the intimidation tactics amounted to witness harassment, The judge granted a temporary order but warned that it wouldn't hold if the company could prove they had legitimate reasons for the investigations. "They're trying to break us," Javier said after the hearing. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and coffee stains on his shirt. "Wear down the families until they drop out of the lawsuit. Make it too scary, too invasive, too expensive to keep fighting." "Is it working?" Grant asked. "2 families have dropped out," Javier admitted. Said they couldn't handle the stress, that they appreciated the money, but they couldn't risk their jobs or their kids or their housing. I don't blame them. This is terrifying for people who don't have resources. Grant felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What about the others?" "Holding steady," Javier said. "But Grant, we need to move faster. Every day this drags on is another day the company can use to intimidate witnesses. We need to get in front of a judge, get this case to discovery, force them to produce documents before they have time to destroy evidence." "How fast can we move?" "Depends on the judge we draw," Javier said. "If we get someone sympathetic, we could have a preliminary hearing within a month. If we get someone who's going to be cautious about going after a major corporation, it could take 6 months just to get past the motion to dismiss." "So we need to get lucky," Grant said. "Yeah," Javier agreed. "We need to get lucky." They didn't get lucky. The case was assigned to Judge Martin Kowalski, a federal judge with a reputation for being extremely thorough, extremely cautious, and extremely protective of corporate defendants. He scheduled the preliminary hearing for 12 weeks out, 3 months of waiting while the company filed motion after motion trying to get the case dismissed before it ever saw a courtroom. The motions were predictable but effective. Calder Industries argued that the families had no standing to sue because they'd already been compensated by Grant personally. They argued that the fraud allegations were based on speculation rather than evidence. They argued that even if the fraud had occurred, it was the action of individual employees and the company couldn't be held liable. Every argument was technically wrong, but every argument required hours of legal work to refute, and every hour meant more billable time for lawyers on both sides. Grant's legal fees hit $1 million in the first month. Simone Hart's follow-up series helped. She ran profiles on 8 families over the course of 2 weeks, each story more heartbreaking than the last. The pieces were beautifully written and meticulously researched, showing not just the fraud itself but the cascading consequences. Medical treatments delayed, educations interrupted, families torn apart by the stress of financial instability. The series won attention from national outlets, and suddenly the story wasn't just a Seattle scandal, but a broader conversation about corporate accountability and the systems designed to help people in crisis. But attention wasn't the same as action. For every person who read Simone's articles and felt outraged, there was another who read Calder Industries' statements and decided the truth was probably somewhere in the middle. For every comment expressing support for the families, there was another suggesting they should just be grateful for whatever help they got and stop complaining. The worst comments were about Nyla. Someone had dug up her school records and leaked them online, pointing out that she'd had attendance issues last year and suggesting that Tessa was neglectful. Someone else posted photos of their apartment building with commentary about how, if they really needed money, maybe they should move somewhere cheaper. A particularly vicious blogger wrote an entire post speculating about whether Tessa had coached Nyla to approach Grant's car, turning a 9-year-old's desperate plea for help into some kind of calculated scam. Grant read that post in Javier's office, his hands shaking with rage. "I want to sue," he said. "Defamation, harassment, whatever it takes. This kid is 9 years old, and they're tearing her apart online because her mother dared to ask for help." "We can't," Javier said gently. "The blogger's probably judgment-proof, and even if they're not, going after them just gives them more attention. The best thing we can do is ignore it and keep fighting the real fight." "The real fight isn't doing enough," Grant said. His voice came out harsher than he'd intended. "We've been at this for 6 weeks, and what do we have? A hearing scheduled for 6 weeks from now. 3 families dropped out because they're being harassed. Vivian Kincaid's still free, still collecting a paycheck from some consulting firm that's definitely connected to her brother's operation, still acting like she's the victim. And meanwhile, Nyla Brooks is getting torn apart on the internet because she had the audacity to believe someone might help her mother." Javier didn't say anything. What could he say? Everything Grant had just listed was true. Grant stood up, walked to the window and stared out at the Seattle skyline. His city. The place he'd built an empire, the place where he was supposed to be making a difference. From up here, it looked beautiful, clean and orderly, full of possibility. You couldn't see the families struggling to make rent. You couldn't see the kids going to bed hungry because their parents had to choose between food and medicine. You couldn't see the systems failing, the bureaucracies grinding people down, the distance between the people who had power and the people who needed help. "I should have seen this coming," Grant said quietly. "Not the lawsuits or the media attacks. I should have seen that the Second Start program wasn't working. Should have noticed when the rejection rate started climbing. Should have questioned why we were sitting on so much unspent money. I had all the data. I had quarterly reports showing exactly how many families we were helping. And I just didn't look close enough." "You can't blame yourself for trusting people," Javier said. "Yes, I can," Grant said. "That's exactly what I should blame myself for. I trusted Vivian because she had the right credentials and said the right things. I trusted the board because they were successful business people who I assumed shared my values. I trusted the system I built because I wanted to believe that good intentions were enough. And while I was trusting people, 271 families were getting screwed." His phone buzzed. Another news alert, another article questioning his motives. He ignored it. "What do you need from me?" Javier asked. Grant turned around. "I need you to be honest. Are we going to win this?" Javier was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I think we're going to win the criminal case against Vivian and Miles. The evidence is too strong, and the AG's office is motivated. But the civil cases? The ones against you? Those are going to be harder. The company has unlimited resources and no incentive to settle. They can drag this out for years, bleed you dry financially, and even if you eventually win, you'll have spent everything you have fighting them." "So you're saying I should give up?" Grant said. "I'm saying you should understand the cost," Javier said, "and make sure it's a cost you're willing to pay." Grant thought about that. Thought about his bank account, his investments, his properties. Thought about the life he'd built and how much of it he was prepared to sacrifice. Thought about Nyla Brooks, who'd stood in the rain because she believed someone might listen. "I'm willing," Grant said. "Whatever it costs, I'm willing." The break came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks before the preliminary hearing, Grant got a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. He'd gotten too many calls from reporters and investigators and people trying to serve him with new lawsuits. But something made him pick up. "Mr. Calder?" The voice was female, young, nervous. "My name is Emily Chen. I used to work in community outreach at Calder Industries." Grant's attention sharpened. "Used to work?" "I quit 3 weeks ago," Emily said, "after I saw the news articles, after I realized what had been happening." She took a breath. "I have emails, internal documents, communications between Vivian Kincaid and her brother about the fraud, and I think you need to see them." Grant was already grabbing his keys. "Where are you?" They met at a coffee shop in Ballard, the same place Grant had met with Simone weeks ago. Emily Chen was 27, Asian American, wearing jeans and a UW sweatshirt and looking like she hadn't slept in days. She had a laptop bag clutched against her chest like a shield. "I should have come forward sooner," she said as soon as Grant sat down. "I knew something was wrong. I knew the rejection rates were too high, but I was scared of losing my job, and I kept telling myself maybe I was imagining things. Maybe there was an explanation I wasn't seeing." "What changed?" Grant asked. "I saw the article about Nyla Brooks," Emily said. "And I thought about all the other families I'd processed, all the applications I'd flagged as potential approvals that somehow got rejected anyway. And I couldn't keep pretending I didn't know." She opened her laptop and turned it toward Grant. "I downloaded everything before I quit. Emails, spreadsheets, approval documents. I shouldn't have. It's probably illegal, but I did it anyway because someone needed to see what was really happening." Grant looked at the screen. It was an email thread between Vivian Kincaid and Miles Kincaid, dated 18 months ago. The subject line was Q2 Processing Update. He started reading. The emails were damning. Vivian and Miles discussed the fraud in language that was barely coded, talking about administrative fees and processing delays, and qualified applicants we can redirect to other resources. There were spreadsheets showing exactly how much money had been diverted each quarter. There were instructions for how to fabricate rejection reasons that would sound plausible. There was even a discussion about which types of families were safest to reject: single parents, immigrants, people with language barriers, anyone who was unlikely to have the resources to fight back. Grant felt sick reading it. Not because it was surprising, he'd suspected something like this existed, but because seeing it laid out so clinically, so deliberately, made it impossible to pretend this had been anything other than calculated theft. "There's more," Emily said. She clicked to another folder. "These are memos from the board. They knew. Maybe not all the details, but they knew the program was rejecting too many people. They knew Vivian's department was sitting on unspent funds. And they chose not to ask questions because the optics looked good. We could say we had this great program while spending as little as possible on it." Grant's hands were shaking as he scrolled through the documents. Board meeting minutes where someone asked about the high rejection rate and was told not to worry about it. Budget reports showing the unspent funds quarter after quarter. An email from Richard Vasquez, the board chair who'd led the vote to remove Grant, saying that the Second Start program's efficiency should be a model for other initiatives. "Can I have copies of these?" Grant asked. "I already made copies," Emily said. She pulled a thumb drive from her pocket and slid it across the table. "Everything's on here. Emails, documents, spreadsheets. Enough to prove that Vivian didn't act alone and that the board knew enough to ask questions but chose not to." Grant took the thumb drive, feeling its weight in his palm like evidence at a crime scene. "Why are you doing this? You could get sued, arrested, definitely blacklisted from ever working in corporate outreach again." Emily met his eyes. "Because I read every one of those rejection letters. I saw the names, saw the addresses, saw the reasons we made up for why they didn't qualify. And I kept thinking about how many of those families had kids. How many of them were exactly like Nyla Brooks, doing everything right and getting screwed anyway because someone decided stealing was easier than helping." She wiped her eyes. "I'm not brave like her. I didn't stand up when it would have made a difference. But maybe I can stand up now." Grant reached across the table and shook her hand. "Thank you. You just changed everything." He called Javier from the parking lot. "I need you to call the AG's office. Tell them we have new evidence, documentary proof that the fraud was systematic, and that board members knew about it." "How solid is it?" Javier asked. "Solid enough to burn the whole company down," Grant said, "and that's exactly what we're going to do." The Assistant Attorney General's name was Rachel Moreno, and she had a reputation for being relentless when she caught the scent of corporate fraud. She was 43, had prosecuted white-collar crime for 15 years, and had a conviction rate that made defense attorneys nervous. When Javier called her office and mentioned new documentary evidence, she cleared her schedule and told them to come in immediately. They met in a conference room at the AG's office downtown, Rachel flanked by 2 investigators and a junior prosecutor who looked fresh out of law school. Grant and Javier sat across from them with Emily's thumb drive, and the moment Grant started explaining what was on it, Rachel's expression shifted from professional interest to predatory focus. "You're telling me you have emails between the Kincaids discussing the fraud," Rachel said, "and you have board meeting minutes showing corporate knowledge of irregularities they chose to ignore." "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Grant said. He plugged the thumb drive into the laptop Rachel pushed across the table and pulled up the email thread. "Read it yourself." Rachel read in silence, her face getting harder with each line. When she finished, she sat back and looked at Grant with something that might have been respect or might have been calculation. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "A former employee," Grant said. "Someone who saw what was happening and couldn't live with staying quiet." "This employee willing to testify?" Grant glanced at Javier, who'd already prepared Emily for this question. "Yes. She understands she might face civil liability for downloading company documents, but she's willing to accept that risk." "She shouldn't have to," Rachel said. "Whistleblower protection should cover her, especially given what's in these files." She turned to one of the investigators. "Get forensics on this. I want authentication, metadata, everything that proves these documents are legitimate and unaltered. And I want search warrants for both Kincaid residences and for Calder Industries servers. If this is what one employee managed to download, imagine what we'll find with full access." The investigator nodded and left. Rachel turned back to Grant. "This changes everything," she said. With this evidence, we're not just looking at fraud charges against Vivian and Miles Kincaid. We're looking at potential RICO charges if we can prove ongoing criminal enterprise. We're looking at charges against board members for conspiracy and obstruction. This is going to get very big, very fast. Good, Grant said. It should be big. 271 families got robbed, and the people responsible need to face consequences. They will, Rachel promised. But Grant, I need you to understand something. Once we move on this, there's no controlling the narrative. The board members who are about to get charged, they're going to claim you orchestrated this as revenge for being voted out. Vivian's going to argue she was following orders from above. The media is going to have a field day, and not all the coverage is going to be favorable to you. I don't care about favorable coverage, Grant said. I care about justice. Rachel smiled, sharp and approving. Then let's get you some justice. The raids happened on a Wednesday morning. Federal agents showed up at Vivian Kincaid's house in Bellevue at 6 a.m. with a search warrant and a forensic team. They showed up at Miles Kincaid's condo in downtown Seattle 30 minutes later. And at 8 a.m., a team of investigators walked into Calder Industries headquarters with authorization to seize all electronic records related to the Second Start program, community outreach operations, and board communications for the past 3 years. Grant wasn't there to see it happen. Rachel had strongly advised him to stay away from the office to avoid any appearance of involvement. But Lila called him at 8:15 with a breathless account of federal agents walking past security, presenting paperwork to the receptionist, and disappearing into the executive suite with boxes and equipment. It's chaos, Lila said. Richard Vasquez is on the phone with the company's lawyers. Half the board showed up, even though it's not a board meeting day. And everyone's asking what the hell is going on. What are you telling them? Grant asked. Nothing, Lila said. I don't work in community outreach. I don't have information about the investigation, and I'm not authorized to comment on ongoing legal matters. Which is all true, and also driving them insane. Grant could hear the satisfaction in her voice. Lila had stayed loyal throughout this entire mess, quietly feeding him information about board discussions and company strategy even though it could have cost her job. She deserved to enjoy watching the people who'd thrown Grant under the bus squirm for a change. Stay safe, Grant told her. And if anyone asks you about me, you haven't talked to me in weeks. Understood, Lila said. But Grant, I'm glad you're doing this. Whatever happens next, I'm glad you didn't let them bury this. The news broke by noon. Federal prosecutors had opened a criminal investigation into Calder Industries' Second Start program, with charges pending against multiple individuals including former Vice President Vivian Kincaid, her brother Miles Kincaid, and potentially members of the company's board of directors. The announcement was careful not to name specific board members, but it confirmed that investigators were looking into whether corporate leadership had knowingly allowed fraud to continue. The stock market reacted immediately. Calder Industries' share price dropped 11% in the first hour of trading. By the end of the day, it was down 23%, wiping out billions in market value and triggering automatic trading halts twice. Grant watched the numbers fall from Javier's office, feeling nothing. He'd built that company. He'd spent 15 years turning it into one of the most valuable tech firms in the Pacific Northwest. His personal wealth was tied up in that stock, and watching it crater meant watching his net worth drop by hundreds of millions of dollars. But all he could think about was Nyla Brooks, standing in the rain with a soggy envelope, believing someone might care enough to help. The stock price didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was making sure the people who'd stolen from families like hers faced consequences. The arrest came 2 days later. Vivian Kincaid was taken into custody at her home on Friday morning, charged with wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and theft of federal funds, the last charge stemming from the fact that some of the Second Start program money had come from government grants for affordable housing initiatives. Miles Kincaid was arrested at his office an hour later, charged with conspiracy, money laundering, and operating a fraudulent enterprise. Both were released on bond by the end of the day, but the damage was done. Their mugshots circulated online within hours, and the narrative that had painted Vivian as a dedicated public servant wrongly accused by a vindictive ex-CEO started to crumble. The board arrests came on Monday. Federal prosecutors charged 3 board members, Richard Vasquez, Patricia Leung, and a tech executive named David Morse, with conspiracy to commit fraud and obstruction of justice. The charging documents laid out how they'd received quarterly reports showing suspicious rejection rates, how they'd been warned by internal auditors that the program's finances didn't add up, and how they'd chosen to take no action because addressing the problem would have required acknowledging it existed. The charges against Patricia hit Grant harder than he'd expected. She'd been one of 2 board members who'd voted to keep him on as CEO. She'd seemed genuinely troubled by what was happening. But according to the prosecutors, she'd known about the problems with the Second Start program for over a year and had voted against bringing in outside auditors to investigate. She chose the company over the truth, Javier said when Grant mentioned it. Same as the others. Maybe she felt bad about it, but she still made the choice. Grant knew Javier was right, but it still hurt to see someone he'd trusted, someone he'd thought shared his values, revealed as just another person who'd decided protecting the institution was more important than protecting the people it was supposed to serve. The media coverage shifted almost overnight. Suddenly, the story wasn't disgraced CEO wages vendetta against former company. It was federal fraud charges reveal systematic theft from struggling families. Outlets that had questioned Grant's motives 2 weeks ago were now running editorials praising his courage. Reporters who'd focused on his personal wealth were now investigating how many other corporate charity programs might be operating the same way. Simone Hart's follow-up piece, an investigation into charity fraud across the tech industry, won a regional journalism award and got picked up by a national magazine. She called Grant the day the award was announced. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said. "Without you being willing to blow up your own company to make it right." "I didn't do it for awards," Grant said. "I did it because a 9-year-old kid was braver than I was, and I was trying to catch up." "Well, for what it's worth, I think you caught up," Simone said. "The families I've talked to, they're not just grateful for the money, they're grateful someone finally believed them when they said the system was broken." Grant thought about that after they hung up, about belief and trust, and the difference between being generous and being responsible, about how easy it had been to write checks and fund programs and think that was enough, about how much harder it was to actually listen when someone said help wasn't reaching the people who needed it. The lawsuits against Grant didn't disappear. Calder Industries was still pursuing claims that he'd violated his fiduciary duty, and Vivian's defamation suit was technically still active, but they lost their momentum. The company's lawyers started making noises about settlement, suggesting they'd be willing to drop their case if Grant agreed to certain conditions. Grant's response, delivered through Javier, was simple: drop the case unconditionally, or he'd countersue for malicious prosecution and use discovery to expose every board member who'd known about the fraud and done nothing. The company dropped the case 3 days later. Vivian's defamation suit lasted slightly longer, but when her own lawyer read the emails between her and Miles discussing how to safely redirect money from qualified families, he withdrew from the case. Vivian tried to find new representation, but every firm she approached looked at the evidence and politely declined. The suit was dismissed 2 weeks before trial. The criminal cases moved forward. Rachel Moreno's team built an airtight prosecution, using Emily Chen's documents as the foundation and layering in evidence seized during the raids. They found emails that were even more damning than the ones Emily had downloaded. Communications where Vivian explicitly discussed targeting vulnerable populations because they were less likely to cause problems. Spreadsheets tracking which families had been rejected under false pretenses. And even a congratulatory note from Miles to Vivian calling her a genius for figuring out how to monetize a charity program. The evidence against the board members was almost as strong. Internal memos showed they'd been warned repeatedly about irregularities in the Second Start program. Audit reports had flagged the high rejection rates and recommended investigation. And in at least 3 board meetings, someone had directly asked whether the program was operating properly and had been told not to worry about it without any follow-up. The trials were scheduled for 6 months out, but Rachel was confident they wouldn't get that far. "They're going to take plea deals," she told Grant in a meeting 4 weeks after the arrests. "The evidence is too strong, and none of them want to risk trial. We're already in negotiations with Vivian's new lawyer. Yes, she found one eventually, and I expect we'll have something locked down within a month." "What kind of deal?" Grant asked. "Prison time," Rachel said flatly. "I'm not agreeing to anything less. Vivian's looking at 4 to 6 years if she pleads, 8 to 10 if she goes to trial and loses. Miles is looking at similar numbers. The board members might get lighter sentences because their involvement was less direct, but they're all going to see jail time. Good, Grant said. He felt no satisfaction saying it, just a grim sense that justice was finally catching up to people who'd thought they were untouchable. The plea deals came through 6 weeks later. Vivian Kincaid pleaded guilty to wire fraud and conspiracy, agreeing to 5 years in federal prison, full restitution to every family she'd defrauded, and permanent prohibition from working in any charitable or nonprofit capacity. Miles Kincaid pleaded guilty to money laundering and fraud, getting 6 years plus the requirement to forfeit all assets acquired through the scheme. Richard Vasquez, Patricia Leung, and David Morse all pleaded guilty to obstruction and received sentences ranging from 18 months to 3 years, along with substantial fines and prohibitions from serving on any corporate board. The day the sentences were announced, Grant sat in Javier's office and tried to feel something other than exhausted. "We won," Javier said. He sounded almost surprised. "They're all going to prison. The families are getting restitution. The system worked." "Did it?" Grant asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it took a 9-year-old kid standing in the rain for anyone to notice something was wrong. It took getting fired from my own company before I could investigate properly. It took a whistleblower risking her career to provide evidence that should have been available through normal oversight. If that's the system working, the system's broken." Javier didn't argue. He just poured them both coffee from the ancient machine in the corner and sat down across from Grant. "So what are you going to do now?" he asked. It was a good question. Grant had spent the last 3 months fighting against the company, against the board, against people trying to intimidate families into silence. He'd burned through millions in legal fees and personal funds. He'd sacrificed his reputation, his position, his comfortable life. And now that the fight was over, now that justice had been served and the criminals were facing consequences, he had no idea what came next. "I don't know," Grant admitted. "I can't go back to Calder Industries. Even if they'd have me, I don't want to work for a company that fought this hard to avoid accountability. But I also can't just walk away. Not when there are still families struggling, still systems failing people, still so much work to do." "Then don't walk away," Javier said. "Do something different. Build something new. Take everything you learned from this disaster and use it to create something that actually works." Grant looked at him. "You have something in mind?" "Maybe," Javier said. He pulled out a legal pad covered in notes. "I've been thinking about this for a while. What if we created a real advocacy organization? Not a corporate charity program where the board can override everything, but an independent nonprofit with community oversight and real accountability. We could help families navigate assistance programs, advocate for policy changes, provide legal support when people get screwed by systems that are supposed to help them." "That's ambitious," Grant said. "So was taking on your own company," Javier pointed out. "And you did that. Why not do something that's actually designed to work from the start?" Grant thought about it. Thought about all the families he'd met over the past 3 months, all the stories of systems failing and bureaucracies grinding people down, and the distance between the people who needed help and the people who were supposed to provide it. Thought about Nyla Brooks, who'd been brave enough to ask for help when she needed it, and smart enough to know that sometimes the system required someone to break the rules to make things right. "I'm in," Grant said, "but I want the families involved. I want community members making decisions, not just wealthy donors. I want the people who've lived through this to have actual power over how the organization operates." "Done," Javier said. He was already making notes. "We'll structure it with a community board that has voting power over major decisions. We'll hire people from the neighborhoods we're trying to serve. We'll build in transparency requirements so everyone can see exactly how money gets spent. And we'll start by helping the families from the Second Start program who still need support even after the restitution." They spent the rest of the afternoon planning, sketching out ideas for an organization that would actually be accountable to the people it served. By the time Grant left Javier's office, it was dark outside, but he felt something he hadn't felt in months: hope. The new organization launched 3 months later. They called it Second Chances, a deliberate callback to the program that had failed so spectacularly, but with a structure designed to prevent the same failures from happening again. Grant put in seed funding from what remained of his personal wealth after legal fees. Javier came on as the legal director. Emily Chen agreed to run operations, finally getting to do the work she'd wanted to do at Calder Industries without interference from people more interested in optics than outcomes. And the community board included 7 members, all of them people who'd been through the system and come out the other side. Marcus Chen, the single father who'd been rejected despite having everything in order. Lisa Park, the woman who'd lost custody of her kids and was fighting to get them back. David Okonkwo, the veteran whose benefits had been called unverifiable. And Tessa Brooks, who'd taken a chance on letting her 9-year-old daughter knock on a billionaire's window and had somehow changed everything. The first board meeting was held in a community center in Rainier Valley, the same neighborhood where Nyla and Tessa lived. Grant stood at the front of the room, looking at the faces of people who'd trusted him with their stories and their struggles, and felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like a cloak. "Thank you for being here," he said. "Thank you for being willing to build something new with us. I want to be clear about what this organization is and isn't. It's not charity. It's not me or anyone else deciding who deserves help. It's us, all of us, creating systems that actually work for the people who need them. You're not here to rubber stamp my decisions. You're here to make decisions. You're here because you know what it's like to need help and not get it, and that knowledge is worth more than any expertise I could bring." Tessa Brooks raised her hand. Grant nodded at her. "What happens if we screw up?" she asked. "What happens if we approve someone who doesn't really need help, or miss someone who does, or make a mistake?" "Then we learn from it," Grant said. "We fix it. We do better next time. But we do it together, and we do it transparently. And we never pretend that mistakes didn't happen because it's easier than admitting we got something wrong." The board members looked at each other. Then Marcus Chen spoke up. "I'm in," he said. "But I have one condition. My kid, my son, who needed surgery, he's doing better now, and he wants to write a thank you letter to whoever started this whole thing. He thinks you saved us, Mr. Calder. But I keep telling him you didn't save us. A little girl named Nyla did. So my condition is this. Whatever we build, however big this gets, we remember that it started because a 9-year-old was brave enough to ask for help when the system said no." "Agreed," Grant said. He looked around the room at faces that had become familiar over the past months, people who'd trusted him enough to keep fighting even when it got hard. "We remember Nyla. We remember every family that got turned away. And we make sure it doesn't happen again." The meeting lasted 3 hours. They discussed funding models, intake processes, accountability measures, and how to balance the need for thorough verification with the reality that people in crisis couldn't wait months for help. They argued, disagreed, pushed back on each other's ideas, and slowly built a framework for something that might actually work. When the meeting ended and people started gathering their things, Nyla Brooks appeared in the doorway. She was wearing jeans and a hoodie, looking more like a regular kid than the girl who'd stood in the rain 3 months ago, and she had a piece of paper clutched in her hand. "Mr. Calder," she said, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Grant walked over and Nyla handed him the paper. It was a drawing done in colored pencils showing a car in the rain and a small figure with her hand pressed against the window. At the top, in careful letters, she'd written, "Thank you for listening." Grant felt his throat tighten. He knelt down so he was at eye level with Nyla. "I should be thanking you," he said. "You're the one who was brave. You're the one who didn't give up. I was just trying to do what you taught me." "What did I teach you?" Nyla asked. Grant thought about that, about the difference between writing checks and actually showing up, about the distance between good intentions and real accountability, about how easy it was to hide behind tinted windows and how much harder it was to roll down that window and listen to someone asking for help. "You taught me that being generous isn't the same as being responsible," he said, "and that sometimes the people with the least power are the ones who have to teach the people with the most power how to actually help." Nyla considered this seriously. Then she said, "My mom says you lost a lot of money doing this, and that you got fired. Is that true?" "Yes," Grant said. "Do you wish you hadn't done it?" Nyla asked. Grant looked past her to where Tessa was standing, watching them with an expression that said she was ready to intervene if this conversation went somewhere uncomfortable. He looked at the community board members gathering their things, already planning the next meeting. He looked at Javier and Emily, who'd risked everything to help build something better. "No," he said. "I don't wish that at all." Nyla smiled, that same determined smile that had convinced Grant to crack his window in the first place. "Good, because my mom's going to be on the board now, and she says we're going to make sure other kids don't have to do what I did. She says we're going to fix the system so it actually works." "We're going to try," Grant said, "but we're going to need help. From people like you who understand what it's like when the system fails. Think you can help us with that?" Nyla nodded seriously. "I can help. I'm good at figuring out when grown-ups aren't listening. I can tell you when you're messing up." Grant laughed, genuine and surprised. "Then you're hired. Every organization needs someone willing to call them out when they're messing up." He stood up, and Nyla ran back to her mother. Tessa caught his eye and mouthed, "Thank you," before shepherding Nyla out the door. One by one, the other board members left too, until it was just Grant and Javier standing in the empty community center. "You really think this is going to work?" Javier asked. Grant looked at the drawing Nyla had given him, at the small figure with her hand pressed against glass, refusing to be ignored. "I think if we listen to the people we're trying to help, if we build accountability into every decision, if we remember that we're here to serve and not to be served, then yeah," he said, "I think it might actually work." They locked up the community center and walked out into the Seattle night. The rain had started again, of course it had, but this time Grant didn't mind. This time the rain felt like a reminder of where all of this had started, with a kid who'd refused to let weather or distance or the certainty that no one would listen stop her from asking for help. Grant had spent 15 years being generous with his wealth and calling it virtue. Nyla Brooks had spent one night being brave with nothing but a soggy envelope and a desperate hope. And somehow, against all odds, that bravery had been enough to start changing everything. 6 months after Second Chances opened its doors, Grant stood in line at a grocery store in Rainier Valley and realized he'd become invisible again. Not the kind of invisible he'd been before. The untouchable billionaire behind tinted windows who people recognized but never really saw. This was different. This was the invisibility of being ordinary, of being just another guy buying coffee and eggs at 9 on a Tuesday morning, wearing jeans that had a hole in the knee and a jacket he'd owned for 5 years. The cashier didn't recognize him. The woman behind him in line didn't do a double take. Nobody asked for a selfie or wanted to talk about Calder Industries, or looked at him like he was anything other than a regular person going about his day. It felt like freedom. His phone buzzed as he was loading groceries into the back of his car, a used Honda he'd bought after selling the Mercedes, because showing up to community meetings in a car that cost more than most people made in 3 years sent exactly the wrong message. It was a text from Emily Chen. "Board meeting in an hour. Tessa wants to discuss the Martinez case. You coming?" Grant texted back a yes and drove to the Second Chances office, a renovated warehouse space in Columbia City that they'd gotten for cheap because the landlord had a brother who'd been helped by the organization and wanted to pay it forward. The space was nothing fancy: concrete floors, exposed pipes, secondhand furniture that didn't match. But it was theirs, and it worked. The community board was already assembled when Grant arrived. 7 people sitting around a conference table that had been donated by a law firm going out of business, drinking coffee from mismatched mugs, reviewing case files with the kind of focused attention that came from understanding exactly what was at stake. Tessa Brooks sat at the head of the table, and that still made Grant smile every time he saw it. She'd fought him on taking a leadership role at first, insisting she wasn't qualified, she didn't have the education, she didn't know how to run meetings. But the other board members had voted her in anyway because they trusted her judgment and her ability to see through bureaucratic nonsense to what actually mattered. 6 months in, she ran meetings with a quiet authority that made professional executives look amateur. "Okay," Tessa said, calling the meeting to order. "We've got 3 cases to discuss today. First is the Martinez family. Lisa, you want to walk us through it?" Lisa Park pulled out a file. She was wearing a blazer over a Second Chances t-shirt, looking more confident than Grant had ever seen her. Getting her kids back had done that, given her something to stand up straight about, given her a reason to believe the system could be made to work if you pushed hard enough. "The Martinez family applied 2 weeks ago," Lisa said. Single mom, 2 kids under 10, working full-time at a hospital as a janitor. She was living in subsidized housing, but the building failed inspection and got condemned. The city relocated some families but missed hers. Clerical error, wrong address in the system. And now she's been staying in her car with the kids while trying to find a new place. She needs first month's rent, deposit, and help covering the gap until her next paycheck. How much are we talking? Marcus Chen asked. $3,200, Lisa said. That gets her into a 2-bedroom in Beacon Hill, covers utilities for the first month, and leaves a small buffer for emergencies. David Okonkwo leaned forward, studying the application. What's her long-term stability look like? We don't want to put her in a place she can't afford to keep. The rent's 30% of her income, Lisa said. Well, within the guidelines. And she's been at the same job for 4 years. Good performance reviews, no red flags. The only reason she's in this situation is because the city screwed up and didn't relocate her when they should have. Then we approve it, Tessa said. She looked around the table, waiting for objections. When none came, she made a note in the file. Lisa, can you coordinate with the landlord and get the funds transferred by end of business today? I don't want those kids sleeping in a car any longer than necessary. Already on it, Lisa said. Grant watched this happen with a feeling he was still getting used to. Pride mixed with relief, mixed with the kind of bone-deep satisfaction that came from watching a system actually work the way it was supposed to. The Martinez case would have taken weeks to process through traditional channels, and that was assuming it got processed at all. Here, it took 15 minutes of discussion and a unanimous vote, and by tonight a mother and her kids would have a roof over their heads. The second case was trickier. A veteran who'd been denied VA benefits due to missing paperwork that he'd submitted 3 times already. The VA insisted they'd never received it. The veteran insisted he had proof of delivery. The whole thing was bureaucratic gridlock of the worst kind, and without someone to advocate for him, he'd probably spend months or years fighting a system designed to wear him down. This isn't really our mandate, one of the board members said. A woman named Sarah Kim who worked in affordable housing and had strong opinions about mission creep. We're supposed to provide direct assistance, not navigate VA bureaucracy. But if we don't help him, who will? David asked. His voice had an edge to it, the kind that came from knowing exactly what it felt like to be on the wrong side of a government system that didn't care. The whole point of this organization is helping people who fall through the cracks. This guy's falling through a crack the size of the Grand Canyon. David's right, Tessa said. If we can help, we should. But Sarah's also right that we need to be careful about scope. We can't be everything to everyone. She looked at Emily. Do we have capacity to take this on? Can we assign someone to work with him on the VA paperwork without pulling resources from other cases? Emily consulted her laptop. Bus. Javier's swamped with the legal cases, but I could bring in one of the volunteer paralegals from the law school clinic. They're always looking for real-world experience, and this would be perfect for them. Then let's do it, Tessa said. We help him get his paperwork sorted, we make sure the VA processes it properly, and we build a relationship with the law school so we can tap into their volunteer pool for future cases. Sarah, you okay with that approach? Sarah considered, then nodded. As long as we're strategic about it, yeah. I just don't want us to lose focus on what we do best. The third case was straightforward, a family needing help with medical bills after their insurance denied a claim that should have been covered. Second Chances had started keeping a small emergency fund specifically for situations like this because medical debt was one of the fastest ways for working families to spiral into crisis. The board approved the assistance in under 5 minutes. When the formal agenda was done, Tessa looked at Grant. You have anything to add? Actually, yeah, Grant said. He pulled out a folder he'd been carrying. I got a call last week from the Seattle Foundation. They want to do a site visit, and they're considering us for a major grant. Could be up to $500,000 over 2 years. The room went quiet. $500,000 was more than their current annual budget. It would mean expanding staff, helping more families, maybe even opening a second location. That's incredible, Lisa said. What do we have to do to get it? Prove we're sustainable, Grant said. Show them we have good governance, community oversight, transparent finances, and measurable outcomes. Basically, show them we're not going to fold in 6 months or turn into the kind of organization that prioritizes optics over impact. So we have to not be Calder Industries, Marcus said dryly. Grant smiled despite himself. Yeah, pretty much. When's the site visit? Tessa asked. 3 weeks. They'll want to meet with the board, review our cases, talk to families we've helped. It's going to be thorough. Good, Tessa said. We've got nothing to hide. We'll show them exactly how we operate and let them decide if that's worth funding. She looked around the table. Everyone okay with that? The board members nodded and the meeting moved into logistics. Who would meet with the foundation representatives, which cases they'd showcase, what financial documentation they'd need to provide. Grant sat back and let the board handle it, because this wasn't his organization anymore. It was theirs. He'd provided seed funding and infrastructure, but the soul of second chances belonged to the people who'd lived through the systems that had failed them and were determined to build something better. After the meeting, Grant stayed behind to help Emily clean up. She was stacking folders and making notes about follow-up items, moving with the efficient precision of someone who'd found exactly the right job for her skills. You think we'll get the grant? She asked. I think we'll deserve it, Grant said. Whether we get it depends on whether the foundation is willing to fund something that actually challenges the status quo instead of just making wealthy donors feel good about themselves. Emily laughed. You've gotten cynical. I've gotten realistic, Grant corrected. There's a difference. His phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made him answer. Mr. Calder, this is Karen Rodriguez from Washington Elementary. I'm calling about Nyla Brooks. Grant's stomach dropped. Is she okay? She's fine, the principal said quickly. Nothing's wrong. I'm actually calling because we'd like to recognize her at our spring assembly. We're honoring students who've shown exceptional community leadership, and Nyla's teacher nominated her. The nomination mentioned that Nyla helped expose fraud in a corporate program and assisted her mother in advocating for vulnerable families. We wanted to verify that story before including it in the ceremony. Grant felt something loosen in his chest. It's true. All of it. Nyla's the reason any of this happened. She's the one who had the courage to ask for help when everyone else had given up. Then we'd like to honor her, Principal Rodriguez said. And we were hoping you might be willing to attend. Nyla mentioned you in her essay, and I think it would mean a lot to her if you were there. I'll be there, Grant said. When is it? Friday afternoon, 2 o'clock. Grant marked it in his calendar, thanked Principal Rodriguez, and ended the call. Emily was watching him with a knowing expression. Nyla? She asked. Getting recognized at a school assembly, Grant said. He found himself smiling. For community leadership. She earned it, Emily said. That kid changed everything. The assembly was held in the Washington Elementary Gymnasium, which smelled like floor wax and childhood and had banners on the walls celebrating reading achievements and perfect attendance. Grant sat in the back row with Tessa, watching as students filed in grade by grade and settled into rows of folding chairs. Nyla was in the 4th grade section, sitting next to a friend and looking more nervous than Grant had ever seen her. The principal gave opening remarks about the importance of community service and standing up for what's right. Then she started calling students to the front, one by one, to receive certificates and have their accomplishments read aloud. When it was Nyla's turn, Principal Rodriguez smiled. Nyla Brooks is being recognized today for extraordinary advocacy and community leadership, she said. Last fall, when Nyla was only 9 years old, she discovered that her family had been wrongly denied assistance from a program designed to help struggling families. Instead of accepting that decision, Nyla took it upon herself to find the person responsible for the program and ask for help directly. Her courage led to the exposure of widespread fraud affecting hundreds of families, resulted in criminal charges against those responsible, and inspired the creation of a new organization dedicated to helping vulnerable community members. Nyla's actions demonstrate that you're never too young to stand up for justice, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help when you need it. The gymnasium erupted in applause. Nyla walked to the front, accepted her certificate, and looked out at the crowd with those same determined eyes that had made Grant crack his window 6 months ago. I want to say something, Nyla said, her voice small but clear in the microphone. Principal Rodriguez looked surprised but nodded. Go ahead. Nyla took a breath. My mom always told me that asking for help isn't weak. She said sometimes the system is broken and someone has to be brave enough to say so. I was really scared that night when I went to find Mr. Calder. I thought he might not listen, or he might be mean, or he might just drive away. But I went anyway because my mom needed help and I didn't know what else to do." She paused, looking directly at Grant in the back row. "I'm glad I was scared and did it anyway, because if I hadn't, nothing would have changed. So I guess what I want to say is, if you see something wrong, even if you're just a kid, you should speak up. Because sometimes the grown-ups aren't paying attention, and someone has to make them listen." The applause was even louder this time. Grant found himself standing, and then the whole gymnasium was standing, giving a 9-year-old girl a standing ovation for having the courage to knock on a window and refuse to be ignored. After the assembly, Grant found Nyla and Tessa in the hallway. Nyla was clutching her certificate and grinning so hard her face looked like it might split. "Did you hear them clapping?" she asked. "Everyone was clapping for me." "You earned it," Grant said. He knelt down so he was at her level. "I'm proud of you, Nyla, not just for what you did that night, but for how you've handled everything since. The interviews, the attention, the people who said mean things online. You stayed brave through all of it." "It was scary sometimes," Nyla admitted. "Kids at school said I was making it up. They said my mom was lying and you were just giving us money because you felt bad. But then the news said we were right, and the people who did the bad thing went to jail, and now everyone knows we were telling the truth." "They do," Grant said. "And because you told the truth, hundreds of other families got help they needed. You changed people's lives, Nyla." Nyla considered this seriously. "Are you still sad about losing your company?" Grant thought about how to answer that. About the Mercedes he'd sold and the penthouse he'd left and the billions in stock value he'd watched evaporate. About the life he'd had 6 months ago, comfortable and untouchable and completely disconnected from the reality of how most people lived. "No," he said honestly. "I'm not sad about it anymore. I thought I was doing important work at that company, but I was really just pretending. Now I get to do work that actually matters, with people who actually care. That's worth more than any amount of money." "Good," Neela said. "Because my mom says you're happier now. She says you smile more." Grant looked at Tessa, who shrugged with a small smile of her own. "It's true. You do." He did smile more, Grant realized. He smiled when the community board solved a problem he would have overthought. He smiled when families came back to volunteer after being helped, wanting to pay it forward. He smiled when he saw the difference between a system designed to protect institutions and a system designed to protect people. He smiled because he'd finally learned the difference between being generous and being responsible, and it had only cost him everything to figure it out. 3 weeks later, the Seattle Foundation conducted their site visit. A team of 3 evaluators spent the day at Second Chances, reviewing case files, interviewing board members, and talking to families who'd been helped by the organization. They were professional, thorough, and gave away nothing about what they were thinking. Grant stayed mostly in the background, letting the board and the families tell their stories. He sat in on one interview where Marcus Chen explained how Second Chances had helped him get stable housing and how he was now volunteering to help other single parents navigate the same systems that had almost broken him. He listened to Lisa Park describe how the organization's advocacy had helped her regain custody of her kids. He watched David Okonkwo show the evaluators his VA paperwork, finally properly processed thanks to the law student volunteer who'd spent weeks fighting bureaucracy on his behalf. At the end of the day, the lead evaluator, a woman named Patricia Moore, who'd spent 30 years in nonprofit philanthropy, asked to speak with Grant privately. They sat in Grant's small office, which was really just a corner of the warehouse, with a desk and a filing cabinet and a window that looked out at a parking lot. "I've done site visits for 20 years, Patricia said, "and I've never seen anything quite like this. Your board is made up entirely of people the organization serves. Your decision-making process is transparent to the point of being radical. You're working on cases that most nonprofits wouldn't touch because they're too complicated or too political. Either you're doing something revolutionary or you're 6 months away from imploding." "Which do you think it is?" Grant asked. Patricia smiled. "I think you're doing something revolutionary. I think you've figured out how to build accountability into the DNA of an organization instead of bolting it on as an afterthought. I think you're making every other nonprofit in this city look bad by comparison, and I think that's exactly what we need." "So we're getting the grant?" Grant asked. "You're getting the grant," Patricia confirmed. $500,000 over 2 years with the possibility of renewal if you hit your benchmarks. But I'm going to be honest with you, Grant. This isn't just about the money. The foundation wants to use second chances as a case study. We want to study your model, document what works, and help other organizations replicate it. Are you okay with that? Grant thought about it. Thought about the months of fighting to build something that actually worked, the hours of arguing with the board about structure and oversight, the painful process of learning to share power instead of hoarding it. Thought about whether he wanted other people picking apart what they'd built and trying to copy it. Then he thought about all the other cities out there with their own versions of Vivian Kincaid, their own broken systems, their own Nyla Brooks waiting in the rain for someone to listen. I'm okay with it, Grant said. On one condition. If other organizations want to learn from us, they have to actually commit to community governance. Not just put a few token people on an advisory board, but actually share power with the people they're serving. No more charity from on high. No more programs designed by people who've never experienced the problems they're trying to solve. That's going to be a hard sell for some organizations, Patricia warned. Good, Grant said. It should be hard, because if it's easy, they're not doing it right. Patricia laughed and shook his hand. I think this is going to be a very interesting partnership. The grant announcement came 2 weeks later, accompanied by a Seattle Foundation press release that praised Second Chance's innovative approach to community-driven assistance. The local media picked it up, and suddenly Grant was doing interviews again. But this time, the story wasn't about him. It was about the organization, the board members, the families who'd been helped and had come back to help others. Simone Hart did a follow-up piece for the Seattle Independent, checking in on the families from her original investigation. Marcus Chen was thriving, his son healthy, and his housing stable. Lisa Park had her kids back and was working toward a degree in social work. David Okonkwo had his VA benefits restored and was volunteering with other veterans navigating the system. And Tessa Brooks was running community board meetings with the kind of quiet competence that made people forget she'd been terrified to take on the role 6 months ago. The article ended with a quote from Nyla, now 10 years old and apparently incapable of being intimidated by reporters. Mr. Calder says, I taught him something, Nyla told Simone. But he taught me something too. He taught me that if you make a mistake, even a really big one, you can fix it. You just have to be willing to work really hard and listen to people who know more than you. And you have to actually care about doing the right thing, not just looking like you care. Grant read that quote sitting in his small apartment, a 2-bedroom in Columbia City that cost 1/10 of what the penthouse had cost and felt more like home than anywhere he'd lived in years, and felt something shift in his chest. He'd spent months thinking about what he'd lost. The company, the wealth, the reputation, the comfortable life where he could write checks and feel virtuous without ever having to actually face the people he was supposedly helping. He'd mourned those losses, grieved for the version of himself who'd believed that good intentions were enough. But what he'd gained was worth so much more. He'd gained the ability to look at himself in the mirror and not see a hypocrite. He'd gained relationships with people who saw him as Grant, not as Grant Calder, the billionaire CEO. He'd gained the knowledge that came from actually doing the work instead of just funding it. He'd gained a 9-year-old's forgiveness and a mother's trust and a community's respect, all of which had to be earned through action instead of bought with money. He'd gained the chance to build something that actually worked. His phone rang. It was Javier. Turn on the news, Javier said. Channel 7. Grant found his remote and flipped to the local news station. The anchor was mid-sentence, reporting on a story that made Grant's heart stop. Sentenced today in federal court, Vivian Kincaid, the former Calder Industries executive convicted of defrauding families through the company's Second Start program, was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Her brother Miles Kincaid received 6 years. 3 former board members also received prison sentences ranging from 18 months to 3 years. The judge called the fraud a betrayal of public trust on a massive scale and noted that the defendants had shown little remorse for their actions. The news showed footage of Vivian being led from the courthouse in handcuffs, her face carefully blank. Grant watched and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, not even relief, just a kind of distant acknowledgement that justice had been served and now everyone could move forward. The news anchor continued. In a related development, the families affected by the fraud have received full restitution through a settlement fund established by the prosecution. Additionally, many have received assistance from Second Chances, a new nonprofit organization founded by former Calder Industries CEO Grant Calder. That organization recently received a major grant from the Seattle Foundation and is being recognized as a model for community-driven charitable work. They showed footage of Second Chances, the warehouse space, the community board meeting, families being helped. And there, at the end of the segment, was a clip of Nyla Brooks from the school assembly saying her piece about speaking up when you see something wrong. Grant's phone started ringing, reporters wanting comments, colleagues offering congratulations, people he hadn't heard from in months suddenly wanting to reconnect. He ignored all of it except one call. From Tessa. "Did you see?" she asked. "I saw," Grant said. "How do you feel?" Grant thought about that. About Vivian Kincaid going to prison and the board members facing consequences and the system finally, belatedly, holding people accountable for stealing from vulnerable families. "I feel like it's over," he said. "The criminal case, the fighting, all of it. Now we can just focus on the work." "Good," Tessa said, "because we've got 17 new applications this week and the board meetings tomorrow. Lisa wants to propose expanding our medical assistance program. Marcus thinks we should start offering job placement services. David's pushing for a veterans advocacy initiative. Everyone's got ideas, and we're going to need your input." Grant smiled. This was his life now. Community board meetings and case reviews and budget discussions and the endless work of trying to build systems that actually served the people they were designed to help. It was harder than running a corporation. It paid a fraction of what he used to make. And it was the most meaningful thing he'd ever done. "I'll be there," Grant said. 6 months after that, on a rainy October evening that felt like a callback to where everything had started, Second Chances held its first annual fundraiser. They debated whether to do it at all. Fundraisers felt too much like the old way of doing things. Wealthy donors writing checks and patting themselves on the back. But they needed sustained funding, and the community board had voted to try it with strict rules. No big corporate sponsors, no naming rights, no treating donors like they were more important than the families being served. The event was held at the warehouse because renting a fancy venue would have sent exactly the wrong message. They'd cleared out the office furniture and set up folding tables with donated decorations. The food was catered by a local restaurant whose owner had been helped by Second Chances after a kitchen fire destroyed his business. The entertainment was provided by a high school choir whose music teacher volunteered with the organization. Grant stood near the entrance, greeting people as they arrived. Some were donors, small dollar supporters who gave what they could because they believed in the mission. Some were volunteers, some were families who'd been helped and wanted to give back, and some were just community members who'd heard about the work and wanted to see it firsthand. Tessa found him halfway through the evening, wearing a dress that was probably borrowed and looking more confident than Grant had ever seen her. "We hit our fundraising goal," she said. "Actually, we're about to exceed it. People keep writing checks." "That's great," Grant said. And it was. Every dollar meant another family helped, another crisis averted, another person who wouldn't have to stand in the rain begging for someone to listen. "There's something else," Tessa said. "The foundation that gave us the grant? They want to expand the partnership. They want to help us open locations in 3 more cities over the next 2 years. Tacoma, Spokane, and Portland to start. They want to prove the model works everywhere, not just in Seattle." Grant felt his breath catch. "That's ambitious." "That's what I said," Tessa agreed. "But the board voted. We're doing it. We're going to need your help with setup and training and making sure the new locations follow the same governance model. But we're doing it." "I'm in," Grant said. There was never any question. "Whatever you need." Tessa smiled and squeezed his arm. "Nyla wants to say something before we wrap up tonight. That okay with you?" "Of course." 10 minutes later, the room quieted as Nyla Brooks climbed onto a chair so she could be seen over the crowd. She was 10 now, wearing a Second Chances t-shirt that was too big for her and holding a microphone that someone had hastily connected to a portable speaker. "Hi," Neela said. Her voice was steadier than it had been a year ago, more confident. "I'm Nyla Brooks, and this whole thing kind of started because of me. I mean, not really because of me. It started because my mom needed help and the system said no, and I got mad about that. But Mr. Calder says I'm the one who made him listen, so I guess I helped. The crowd laughed gently. Nyla continued, I learned something this year. I learned that sometimes when you ask for help, people say no. And sometimes they say no because they're mean or they're stealing or they just don't care. But sometimes you get lucky and you find someone who does care, someone who's willing to listen and actually do something instead of just saying they're sorry and walking away. She looked directly at Grant. Mr. Calder listened. And then he did something. And now my mom has a job helping other people, and we have a home, and I don't have to be scared anymore. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone here who's helping Second Chances work. You're making it so other kids don't have to do what I did. You're fixing the system, and that matters. The room erupted in applause. Nyla hopped down from the chair and disappeared into the crowd, immediately surrounded by people wanting to congratulate her. Grant watched her go and felt the weight of the past year settle over him. Not heavy, just present. A reminder of where they'd been and how far they'd come. Someone touched his elbow. He turned to find an older woman, probably in her 60s, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. Mr. Calder, I'm Susan Martinez. You helped my daughter and grandchildren 6 months ago when they lost their housing. Grant remembered the case. Single mom, 2 kids, city clerical error, $3,000 to get them stable. How are they doing? Wonderful, Susan said. My daughter got a promotion at work. The kids are thriving in their new school, and she's been volunteering with Second Chances, helping other families navigate housing applications. She says she wants to pay it forward. Susan's eyes filled with tears. I just wanted to thank you for listening when my daughter asked for help, for not making her feel small or ashamed for needing it. You gave her back her dignity, and that's worth more than the money. Grant felt his throat tighten. Your daughter did the hard part. She asked for help. She filled out the application. She kept going even when the system failed her. We just made it a little easier. Still, Susan said, thank you. She walked away, and Grant stood alone in the middle of the fundraiser, surrounded by people who'd learned the same lesson Nyla Brooks had taught him a year ago, that asking for help wasn't weakness, that systems could be changed if enough people demanded it, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was refuse to accept that things had to stay broken. The fundraiser wound down around 9. People drifted out into the October rain, calling goodbyes and promises to volunteer more hours. The cleanup crew, mostly board members and their families, started breaking down tables and packing up decorations. Grant was helping fold chairs when Javier found him. We need to talk about the expansion, Javier said. Tacoma wants to move fast. They've already identified a potential board member pool and found office space, but they need someone to do the initial training on governance and intake processes. I can do it, Grant said. When do they need me? Next week. 3 days of intensive training, then monthly check-ins for the first 6 months. Javier paused. You sure you're ready for this? 3 new locations is going to mean a lot of travel, a lot of time away from Seattle. Grant looked around the warehouse at the space they'd built, the organization that had grown from one 9-year-old's desperate plea for help into something that was about to expand across 3 cities. He thought about all the families in Tacoma and Spokane and Portland who were struggling right now, waiting for systems to work, hoping someone would listen. I'm ready, Grant said. Let's go help them build something that works. 1 year after Nyla Brooks had knocked on his window in the rain, Grant Calder stood in front of a community board meeting in Tacoma and realized he'd finally become the person he'd always claimed to be. Not a billionaire CEO with good intentions, not a philanthropist writing checks from a safe distance, but someone who actually showed up, who listened when people said the system was broken, who was willing to share power instead of hoarding it, who understood that real change required more than money. It required accountability, transparency, and the humility to learn from the people you were trying to help. The Tacoma board was made up of 7 community members, all of them people who'd experienced housing insecurity, medical debt, or bureaucratic failures. They asked hard questions. They pushed back on his suggestions. They demanded proof that this model would work for their community, not just for Seattle. Grant answered their questions honestly. He admitted when he didn't know something. He shared the mistakes Second Chances had made and how they'd learned from them. He talked about Nyla Brooks and how a 9-year-old had taught him that listening was more important than having all the answers. By the end of the meeting, the Tacoma board had voted to move forward with the second chances model, but with modifications specific to their community's needs. Grant left feeling energized in a way he never had after corporate board meetings, because this wasn't about protecting an institution or maximizing shareholder value. This was about building something that would actually help people. His phone rang as he was driving back to Seattle. It was a number he didn't recognize, but he answered anyway. "Mr. Calder? This is Amanda Chen. You don't know me, but you helped my cousin Marcus last year when he needed housing assistance. I'm calling because I work for a family foundation in Portland, and we're interested in partnering with Second Chances on the expansion there. Do you have time to talk?" Grant smiled and pulled over to the side of the road so he could take notes. "I have time," he said. "Tell me what you're thinking." The conversation lasted an hour. By the time it ended, Portland had a potential funding partner, a list of community leaders to recruit for the board, and a timeline for opening their location by spring. Grant sat in his car in a rest stop parking lot somewhere between Tacoma and Seattle, rain drumming on the roof, and thought about the journey that had brought him here. About the man he'd been a year ago, comfortable and disconnected and convinced that wealth and good intentions were enough. About the moment Nyla Brooks had appeared at his window and forced him to see the distance between the version of himself he presented to the world and the person he actually was. About everything he'd lost and everything he'd gained and whether he'd make the same choices again if given the chance. He would, without hesitation. Because the life he was living now, modest apartment, used car, work that actually mattered, was worth more than all the billions and board positions and magazine covers combined. His phone buzzed with a text from Nyla. "Mom says you're in Tacoma helping start a new Second Chances. Does that mean more kids won't have to stand in the rain asking for help?" Grant texted back. "That's exactly what it means." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, "Good. I'm glad I helped you learn how to listen. See you at the next board meeting." Grant laughed and put his phone away. Then he started the car and drove back to Seattle, back to the warehouse office and the community he'd found, and the work that never seemed to end but somehow never felt like a burden. Because Nyla Brooks was right. She had taught him how to listen. And once you learned that lesson, really learned it, let it change you from the inside out. There was no going back to the person who'd hidden behind tinted windows and called it leadership. Grant Calder had been generous for 15 years. Now he was learning to be responsible. And that, he thought, as the Seattle skyline appeared through the rain, made all the difference.